that's the second position. Well, when somebody died, we did this. Well, when somebody is
Yep.
And the interesting bit that goes into that is that they're able to identify that what they did, they passed. And then you find the same religious expression. For example, in Brazil, you would find religions from West Africa, like based on Lusaka, they actually would use the Catholic saint because then the owners would say, oh, they were worshiping saints. The names that would reflect the Kumbu or Shama and so forth. They would just go to bondage. But the exact same thing that happened in the Jewish in that region of Italy, and some of those family protections were living in DNA. But the problem is that our we culture, I mean, in America, like my kids are half Japanese, half Italian, but they were born in New Zealand, they hold 3 passports, they don't get married.
My wife's a third culture kid too, yeah. She was born in America, but grew up in Saudi Arabia, then grew up in Lebanon, now she's back here.
They don't, even there were things that I realized by kids with marriages that my kids started to realize that one that they never had to school. Before that, they were never pointed out that hold on, because they were associated as Asians in place. If people see what they're not, they were associated
Testing.
Telling a story. And you have to have an idea of where you want that narrative to bring the audience. At the same time, you have to listen to the audience that you're communicating with and making sure that what you think they're using for elements in the story resonate with them, so that they can actually be on that path to where you want to go. So yeah, that's good. It's good. So I'm actually I'm an academic, but I'm kind of all over. So I'm on the faculty at NIH. They have a graduate school there. I work for a private tutoring company that does one-on-one education as well. And then I started my own consortium to kind of mix in all the because I've known Dan for the past 6 years. And, you know, just policy, consulting, education, and communication, and all that. So I decided I was like, you know what, I need to find some order to all of this, and I'm trying to develop new materials.
I need to head back to Maryland.
Thanks everyone for your generosity with regards to conversations at lunch, and now to hear the CSPO director, Daniel Sarowitz.
Do I need to use a mic? Yes.
All right. So I'll just.
Says the AV guy, right?
Yes, exactly. Because what I don't need to be is so far away from you all. I don't think so.
I'm just kidding.
Yes. Okay. So now for something completely different. Let's see how to start. You're all talking about data and big data and numbers, and I want to tell some stories about numbers because I think often we take data as this thing that you're leaving right on time. So congratulations.
He's going to give you a full report.
Okay.
Right, that's the deal, right?
All right.
Otherwise, I'll sit back and
you know, a really interesting question to me is when you look at data, is what does it actually mean? Where does it come from? What is it telling us? And especially quantified information, quantified data, has a particular status and privilege in the world. And I think a fundamental assumption is that when something is quantified, it's telling us something about a correspondence between what we know and the real world. And our ability to quantify, you know, Galileo said mathematics is the language of nature. The ability to quantify is I think often assumed to be and is presented as if there's an ability to say something that directly corresponds to something in nature. So I want to tell a couple of stories about something different. These are really different kinds of numbers than the sort that you're dealing with, but I don't think that there's, I think there's some application, because an issue that I only saw the end of Bob's talk and I didn't see science and political disagreement. And when numbers and science and political disagreement come together, interesting and weird things happen. So I'm just going to give a few examples of that. Let's see. Am I starting here? This is the first one? Yes. Okay. Maybe I think I'll start with, I'm going to start with the second one. I'll go back to the first one. So I'm just going to tell a few stories about numbers and ask and to raise the question about how we know what they actually mean. So one thing that the United States government does every so often is it comes up with an estimate of the amount of natural gas and oil under the ground as a way to kind of project energy futures, to provide information for economists and oil companies and investors and so on. Very important numbers. So where do these numbers come from? They come from basically a bunch of experts sitting around the room. That's where they used to come from. Now they come from a bunch of experts sitting around the room plugging a lot of numbers into computers. But what are they really telling us? So every few years, the U.S. Geological Society and EIA, the Energy Information Administration, come up with hard numbers about the number of, for example, billions of barrels of oil or trillions of cubic feet of natural gas under the surface of the Earth, okay? In the United States, that's what we're interested in. So, for example, in 1975, the USGS, through a deliberative process that included a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations, a bunch of Delphi expert elicitations, came up with a number that the US had about 1,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas under the Earth's surface. And that number basically was derived from getting a lot of experts, regional experts together, who understood all the different oil and gas fields, understood oil extraction processes, were experts in these matters, and they together come up with a number. So what should happen to that? That's supposed to represent the amount of stuff that's under there. It should be said, of course, there's no way to confirm that. There's no way to actually know whether that number corresponds to something real. But you could intuit, right, that what should happen to that number over time? Well, we use natural gas up, so the number ought to go down. I think we use about, on average, something like, I think it's 20 trillion cubic feet a year. So the number should go down. So what happens between 1975 and 1981 when the next assessment occurs? So the bottom line is that's just 20 trillion cubic feet a year if it's the consumption, and the upper line connects to the dot that's the next estimate of natural gas. So the upper line, the black line, it's just a line connecting the old estimate to the new estimate, the 1981 estimate. The bottom line is what the trend would have been if this was simply a matter of consuming and drawing down the amount. Okay, so something great is happening here. We're using up natural gas and we're getting more of it. So how's that happening? Well, it's happening because, in fact, all sorts of things allow you to extract more natural gas than you could have extracted before, and to discover natural gas that you didn't know was there before. So new technologies allow you to get gas from new places, or to take it out of, take a higher percentage of it out of fields where it used to be, and so on. And so that number can go up over time, even as we're continuing to use natural gas. And then this trend continues. By 1995, we should really be drawing down our natural gas resources, but in fact, they continue to increase as technology continues to allow us both to discover new sources of natural gas and also to extract it more effectively. And then fracking happens and things really take off, right? So this is great, kind of Sorcerer's Apprentice thing. We keep getting more and more natural gas, even though we keep using more and more of it. So the first question is, what do these numbers actually mean? What do they correspond to? One way to think about this is to think about the processes by which, and to look at the politics and the context in which these numbers are developed. Okay. So it turns out there's two kinds of natural gas reserves that you can make estimates of. One called undiscovered conventional, and the other is unconventional. So undiscovered conventional is stuff that we have the technological ability to extract, and we just think we can estimate how much it is. And unconventional is stuff that we can't extract now, but we may be able to extract in the future. So 1975, there's the number again. It actually had uncertainty bars around it, which I didn't show. Those are 95% confidence intervals. So that 1975 number of 500 million, that's the reason it was higher on the other. Let's see, what was it on the other graph? It was, yeah, because that included both unconventional and conventional. So 1975 number for undiscovered conventional has a pretty big error bar. By the time we get to 1981, the number has gone up a lot because we figured out how to get all sorts of new gas. Interestingly, the low estimate, the 95% minimum estimate of the 1981 number is at about the mean of the 1975 number. That's the red line just to indicate that. And then when we get to 1987, the conventional, where the undiscovered conventional number actually drops down, there the high end of the estimate, the 95% high end, is at the mean of the 1975 number. So what are these uncertainty bars telling us? It's completely unclear what relationship they have to anything in nature. They have a relationship to the beliefs of the scientists who are coming up with these numbers, but you can't make any kind of coherent statistical argument about something that goes from the bottom end of a 95% error bar to the top end of a 95% error bar in 6 years. Now, at this point, something really interesting goes on politically, because between 1981 and 1987, we have a big price spike. We also have a change in political regime. President Reagan is elected. Policies around energy change. We stop messing around with this renewable stuff, start putting more money into conventional carbon-based energies, and there's an interest in deregulating the natural gas market. So the 1987 number, okay, which shows a decline to 400 trillion cubic feet, elicited a huge political backlash. And in fact, the head of the USGS was almost fired as a result of this number, because what it signaled to the markets was that we had a declining reserve just at a time when the administration wanted to deregulate the natural gas market, which is a time that they were trying to trigger more investments in natural gas exploration in the US. So those two things didn't go together. So that was a very unhappy number. Now, who was it who came up with that number? Well, it was a bunch of government scientists who had been doing things the same way for many, many years, kind of a very fixed methodology, as I alluded to, just a bunch of experts who knew about different fields, getting their numbers together and coming up with totals. But the Reagan administration did not like this, this number, and they decided that going forward there had to be a different process, and that different process would have to be more inclusive, and it would have to include industry representatives who had their own view of what the future of natural gas ought to look like. So in 1995, which was the next time a formal estimate was constructed, we had a continuing decrease in undiscovered conventional resource, so down to just about 275 trillion cubic feet. But at the same time, the analysis included, for the first time, this unconventional resource. And the unconventional resource was pretty big. So if you add the two together, you come up with the 1995 total there, the little red diamond, which gets you back up into the zone where it looks like the resource is increasing. And that number made everybody happy. So the 1987 number, which was generated by a particular group of scientists in a particular agency, made everybody unhappy. And the 1995 number, which was generated by a much more inclusive group of scientists, including industry, academia, environmental groups, and private sector, made everyone happy because it included them all. They all got to participate in constructing this number. What the number has to do with nature and with what's out there, we have no idea. But we do know that the process of creating it became satisfactory after being... So what I simply want to suggest with this is what makes these numbers valuable is their utility. So we got the numbers that we needed. What those numbers have to do with oil and gas underground is anybody's guess. But we can say that we know how to get useful numbers by having useful processes of research. So let me go back to this earlier graph. So this is another story, a case. This is the problem of how do we isolate high-level nuclear waste. There's a long story, and I'm going to keep it very short. But the Congress, in its wisdom in the mid-1980s, selected the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, near the Nevada test site, where we had tested nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s, as the place where we would store our high-level civilian nuclear waste, so the stuff that's created by nuclear reactors for civilian energy. And one of the important characteristics of a waste site is that it needs to be dry, because if there's water moving through the site, then it'll corrode the containment vessels, and eventually, if they get corroded and the waste inside gets exposed to the environment, then the water can carry it out into the water table and beyond the repository and so on. So you need to show that you have a dry site. One of the key variables in the models, assessment models for showing the wetness of the site, is something called percolation flux. Percolation flux is a kind of an odd, kind of one-dimensional variable, millimeters per year, but just think of it as it measures the rate within which a unit volume moves through the rocks around the repository site, and so you're averaging this across an entire site that's 1,000 meters below the Earth's surface. Circled in blue are the two earliest estimates of percolation flux. And those were done by my kin, geologists, field geologists who had worked in the area for 20 or 30 years, had a very good kind of craft sense feel for the hydrological system. And there were two independent estimates, one of about 8, by the way, that's a logarithmic scale on the left, that will be important in a minute. One of about 8 millimeters per year and the other about 1 millimeter per year. And so those were the earliest assessments before Yucca Mountain had been chosen as a site. From 1984 to the mid-1990s were a series of assessments demonstrated to either show that the site would be acceptable for nuclear waste or would not be. And again, one of the key attributes was, would it be dry? Well, it turned out that to make the assessments adequate to meet the standards set by the US government, which had to be safe in terms of certain level of radionuclide release for 10,000 years, you needed to have a percolation flux of between about 0.1 and 1 millimeter per year. And we went from this very unsophisticated field geologist, craft skilly stuff to doing lab tests, pushing water through rocks from the field area, and hydrologic models, complex numerical models. And those models converged around numbers between 0.1 and 1 millimeter per year, which were the numbers necessary to show that the site would actually be safe. So a lot of stability there. You could call that replicability over a period of almost 15 years. Within one order of magnitude, you're getting a pretty stable level of percolation flux. I gave this talk about this recently at the Academy, and some wise-ass subatomic particle physicists said, well, what are the uncertainty bars? And I was too flustered to answer the question correctly, which is what do you want them to be? And I don't even mean that, in a, well, I do, I guess, mean it facetiously, but I also mean that you can get a bunch of scientists together and hold a metaphorical gun to their head and say, tell us what your probability distribution is for this particular number, and they'll do it, and that's what was done with these. So they all had probability distributions around them. These are the means. Then something changed in 1997. A tunnel was actually dug to the level of the repository site at 1,000 meters below the surface. And let me just re-emphasize the point I've been making all along. These are numbers that are supposed to correspond to something real. That something real is an abstraction. That is the overall integrated rate with which water flows through a highly heterogeneous set of rocks in the site. But they all converge. It looks like science. It looks like a real number. So they drill a tunnel to the level of the site, 1,000 feet below the surface, and sample some water from that. And they do isotopic testing at Los Alamos National Laboratory, or weapons lab, and they discover high levels, meaning parts per billion, of an isotope called chlorine-36. Chlorine-36 is bomb pulse chlorine. That is, it didn't really exist very much in the universe before we started blowing up weapons. The natural concentrations is about 1 part per 10 billion. But with bombs, we've upped that an order of magnitude to about a part per billion. It turned out there was some chlorine-36 in these numbers. Now, that didn't instantly translate into a different percolation flux, but it told you that water was getting from the surface, where the bomb tests were, to 1,000 feet below the surface in 50 years, which is much faster than those lower percolation flux would allow. So what did we do? We got 7 experts together, held a gun to their head. They did a Delphi expert elicitation, and decided that this implied that an order of magnitude higher number of about 10. Okay, so now are we looking at something that corresponds more to nature? Well, maybe, except that the Department of Energy quite, reasonably said, well, we're doing science here, so we better replicate this number. So they asked a different weapons laboratory, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, to do the isotope analysis, and they came back and said, there's no elevated chlorine-36 there. Those jerks at Los Alamos, they contaminated their sample. So Los Alamos redid the analysis and reconfirmed the presence of the chlorine-36, and Lawrence Livermore redid the analysis and reconfirmed that it was contamination, and a third party was brought to the University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and they said they couldn't tell. It turns out what. Yeah, right. So it turns out probably this had to do with sample preparation. And this tells you something about complex systems, right? Because who knew? So it turns out that we don't understand the interactions between grain size of a sample and chlorine-36 isotopes. And Los Alamos was using finer grain samples than Lawrence Livermore. So which was the right answer? Well, if we had only done one, if we had only stopped at Lawrence Livermore, we could have said, well, that's the right answer. But instead, we tried to replicate it. We came up with 2 contrary instances. We realized that actually our uncertainty was greater than we could have ever imagined if only we had left things the way they were before, when we really thought we had some consistent numbers. But now, now we don't know what to make of those numbers. And then 2 more recent exercises in 2003, a paper publishing some new hydrological models. They very helpfully came up with an uncertainty range of between 0 and 20 millimeters a year. And then the most recent one I could find in 2013 with about a 1 to 40 percolation flux range. So we're back to uncertainties that are at least as great and probably greater than they were when those geologists wandering around the field. So what I want to say here is, A, who knows what those numbers mean? B, the relationship between the science and the institutional context is critical for the generation of the numbers and for the interpretation of the numbers. Is this good quality science? Sure, it's good quality science. What does that mean? It's good quality in that it gets published, it gets peer-reviewed, it gets used. And meanwhile, $13 billion, by the way, has been spent at Yucca Mountain, and we still can't decide whether or not it's a safe site.
Million or billion?
Billion, 13 billion. Okay, last example from the issue I hate above all, which is climate change, where all these problems exist in spades. There is a very important number at the heart of the way we talk about climate change called climate sensitivity. Climate sensitivity is the increase in temperature that would occur if there was an instantaneous doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere from pre-industrial levels, and that achieved equilibrium. You want to know, what would the temperature increase be for that instantaneous doubling? It's just kind of, again, it is an abstraction. It is not something real in nature. It is something we spend a long time trying to figure out how to quantify. The number was first used in the late 70s and early 80s. It was entirely a back-of-the-envelope number that was derived from looking at a bunch of different climate models. The lowest number coming from models was something around 2 degrees for a doubling. The highest was something around 5 or 6 degrees for a doubling. So scientists agreed very casually, this is well documented, very casually, that they'd say the range was 1.5 to 4.5 degrees for a doubling. Okay, so we have a range based on models these are numerical models that are trying to approximate what's going on in the behavior of the climate. This range is generated, it's supposed to reflect the low end and the high end. There's no probabilities implied whatsoever. And there's a fudge factor involved. If you look at the 1985, I guess it's the 83 Academy number, maybe it's the 85 one. But you'll see that the actual ranges coming from the models is not the same as the ranges that are published. So the number on the left is the ranges that the models yielded. The number on the right is the published numbers. And those published numbers were just kind of basically said, well, 2 seems a little bit too high as the low number, so let's kick it down a little bit. 3.5 doesn't quite seem as high as our intuition suggests. Let's kick it up a little bit. So the range became 1.5 to 4.5. This became subsequently of biblical significance. You will see that that number has not changed now in almost 40 years. The 2013 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Assessment for Climate Change Science Assessment Organization, still reports the number at 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. So 30 years and untold billions of dollars later, we still have exactly the same uncertainty range for an abstraction whose relationship to the actual climate we can't fully understand. Most recently, 2 publications in the last year that I found. So remember, this started out as having no statistical significance. It was simply a report of different models. But it began to take on some statistical significance in the last 10 or 15 years. And most recently, we see a paper in 2017 reporting a mean climate sensitivity of 2.8 degrees with a standard deviation that gives you a range of 2.2 to 3.4 degrees. And another paper published just a year later, a whole degree higher. That's a lot in terms of global warming, by the way, with a completely different uncertainty range. So we're now assigning uncertainties, probabilities, to numbers that initially were supposed to have no probabilistic significance whatsoever, and still remains an abstraction. Okay, so I've made the point. I don't think I need to make it again. Is that when you get these intersections of politics and science and complex open systems where scientists are struggling to understand how to get a foothold in characterizing those systems, you come up with things that are called data that then get plugged into models, that get repeated, that get used, that get cited. But when you look at the pedigree of those, it's very hard to know what they actually mean and what they're actually telling you. One final example from a completely different domain, which is nutrition science. This will be a quote from the great mischief maker John Ioannidis about what's going on in nutrition scientists. Almost all nutrition. So this is why is it that today caffeine is really good for me and tomorrow it's going to cause cancer? Well, here's why. Almost all nutritional variables are correlated with one another. If one variable is causally related to health outcomes, many other variables will also yield significant associations in large enough data sets. With more research and more big data, we can get everything to correlate with everything else. Okay, so this is a somewhat different problem than 3 examples I gave you before, but it's another angle on the quality problem and the data problem and the question of what does it actually mean to have a number. In this case, we don't understand the mechanisms that lead to one particular variable, a particular nutrient or particular food that we intake as individuals. How do we then understand what that means on a population-wide basis? Ioannidis has also shown that if people know the old Joe Jackson song, actually everything does give you cancer, but also everything doesn't give you cancer. So again, I bet all of us have nutritional habits that we really believe because we think that we read something somewhere that had an effect on us about what we ought to eat and what we ought to not eat. And the thing that we all know to be true is, well, everything in moderation. Just like don't go too crazy and you'll probably be fine. That doesn't sound very scientific. This stuff is all really scientific, but what it means is very, very hard to parse out. So all I wanted to do really in this diatribe was simply lay on the table that the question of quality is actually a profound one that requires understanding the pedigree of all the numbers that we unthinkingly integrate into all the models that we use and all of the portrayals that we assemble to try to understand these complex systems, whether it's the genomic correlations with a particular type of cancer or the question of how much the climate is warming. So I will shut up.
Questions?
Real quick, Dan, I just wanted to comment on how You know, absolutely. Where the data comes from is a huge component in quality. I was talking to a CBO earlier and saying, you know, hold fast not to your conclusions but to your methods that you use to find them, because it's, you know, therein lies the resilience of how you're finding your data. And then I was speaking with Amy briefly about narrative and audience, and I think that component matters as well. And you know, who's generating that data, for what purpose, who are they speaking to, and what do they think that that audience wants to hear or needs to hear, or something like that. We can say all we want that there's the white hats of science and that they're never going to necessarily sway things in one direction, but I think we agree that that's not necessarily the case either. And it just reminds me, I was teaching math to a student the other day, and I told him the joke. I was like, 3 statisticians went hunting, and you know, they see a buck, and you know, excuse the hunting aspect of this, but one shoots and it goes left, one shoots and it goes right, one shoots above, and all 3 go nailed it, because statistically they did. And that's the idea: is that who's the one generating that data? How is that data coming to be? And where does that put us for the quality and therefore trust that we can have in it when we use it to project towards the future? And then the projection, like we were saying before, oh, we're going to have this much and we should expect the flux to go down because of consumption. But then, like you said, well, the landscape changes. Now all of a sudden we have technology that tells us how much more we can get out of the earth. So in fact, how useful was that assessment before when we thought?
It was useful, but what did it mean?
Right, sure, yes. So thank you.
And just very quickly, there is a, I mean, for those interested in kind of social science theory around this, which may be none of you, but there is a way that my sort talks about this kind of thing, which is that a lot of the science at the intersection of politics and science, where you're dealing with complex open systems, where you're dealing with political disagreement, where you have to make, where there's so there's contested facts, really is not, it's simply not the same thing as physics or chemistry, and yet we hold it to the same standards, and that's where a lot of mischief comes in, because we expect that when a number is given, it has the kind of crisp meaning that you know, a Newtonian equation would have. It doesn't. They are different things, and we really need to get used to the fact that science carried out in what some call the post-normal context is not the same thing as science carried out in a controlled experiment in a lab where the context is known, the system is closed, you can control all the variables. It's not that it's just more difficult, and if we only had a bigger computer model, we'd be able to figure out. It is actually a different type of thing, which is a really hard idea to get across, because all the legitimacy for calling it science to begin with comes from the science that's in that lower left-hand quadrant. So I think this is a really big challenge for figuring out how to bring what we can learn about the world into political discussions about what is to be done, because it's so easy and seductive to say that when we have a number, it's a number just like one of those normal science numbers, when actually it's something very different.
So if you don't understand where the, I mean, so how can you evaluate the quality of the number?
Yeah, so the somewhat radical argument that I actually largely buy into is that if people are satisfied with it, it's good quality. Now, there's a scientific answer around some things, like, well, we couldn't replicate the chlorine-36 number, so therefore it's not a good number. Okay, but for something like the hydrocarbon numbers, there's no right answer. There's no real answer. So the question is utility. I'd say the same thing is true with the Yucca Mountain problem as a whole. It turns out that if Barack Obama had not been elected president, but who ran against him? Was it McCain? John McCain had been elected president. that number would be fine, and we'd be putting nuclear waste in the ground. Okay, we're not putting it in the ground because Democrats didn't want to put hydrocarbons in the ground, because Harry Reid, the senator from Nevada, was the Senate president, and he wasn't going to support any Democratic candidate who. So the science was not good enough quality because the politics wouldn't let it be. If it had been John McCain, there would have been plenty good quality. So it's really about what's the context of use. It's not about some objective measure about does it really correspond to something real out there, which is a completely alarming notion to us children of the Enlightenment. But we're trying to manage complex natural and socio-technical systems, which are, again, open, largely unpredictable. So we may have to get out of our little kind of Enlightenment obsession with kind of truth and causation and accept that some things are going to be melanges of the scientific and the political and the value-laden and the practical. So I think quality is largely determined by whether it turns out to be useful and valuable. Now, I understand that the instant kind of reaction to that is, well, how's that going to help cure cancer? Well, there's some really interesting questions around that. As a person who's decided never to get a PSA test because I don't believe the statistics, I think some of these questions are very relevant to issues of human health. But that being said, a key difference between these kinds of cases and something like, say, breast cancer or prostate cancer is there's no end point to these. You know, there is a good end point. We know what mortality from breast cancer or prostate cancer is, and we can tell if it's going down. But there's nothing, even on a fairly short term, so we can get feedbacks from learning that allow us to know whether what we're doing works or not. Whether the numbers are good is a different question. These kinds of systems, that will never happen because people will even argue about what the appropriate endpoints are. So the best we can aim for is political solutions that use the best numbers that we have to do the best that we can and accept that it's about, again, about this kind of post-normal bringing together of different constituencies and interests to decide what numbers work. Did you hate that answer?
I don't want to say I hated that answer, but I think it's a very unsatisfying answer.
Sure.
Because it's very unsatisfying because it sort of opens up this whole sort of Pandora's box with our current president who has problems with fake news and fake facts because you're now saying, well, facts aren't facts. They're sort of what everybody agree, you know, if the majority agree on this, it's a fact. And I'm just not sure I want to believe that.
So I'm not quite saying that.
Okay.
But I am saying that, but what I would say is, I'd say that the current president is a consequence of us not taking this problem seriously, not the cause of it. And that it is, in fact, the insistence that numbers that are very mushy, political, complicated, contextually embedded, tell us what we ought to do politically, an insistence that is somewhat characteristic of my side of the political aisle, is a political move, and I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that. Now, you know, I don't think we have any problem when someone says, who might say this, my crowd's bigger than your crowd, and we have two pictures, and one of them shows a big crowd, and it ain't that one. That's obviously, you know, not true. But there is a huge, huge gray area where most complex politics lies. And if we're going to continue to insist that it has to be driven by our set of facts, the problem is not going to get solved. I think we'll end up with more of what we have rather than less of it. Not satisfactory, but actually it may point a way forward that's hopeful in terms of democratic institutions, but it's going to require some give. So.
I can just kind of state the obvious that the examples you gave came from kind of the natural world in which things change, dynamic systems change, but relative to the change that I was referring to earlier, and I think we talked about algorithmic growth of data, those dynamic systems are even more sensitive to this kind of analysis because you have to back down to the experts, because you have to find experts who can then try to assess the rapidly changing system, and they're all coming from different perspectives. So as we start to go to human systems and abstractions as opposed to physical worlds, this becomes. And by the way, I do this for a living, right? Right now I've got a $100 million problem that somebody asked me the facts, I gave the answer. Then the client came back and says, what do you want the answer to be? We could argue this or we could argue that. And I always remember back in, I have a accounting and finance degree, and there was a joke about the analyst got the joke, cost justify the private jet. He did the numbers, doesn't make sense, he set it up. It came back down, exactly the same work order. It said cost justify, underline, the corporate jet. And in the future world that we're going into, how can we expect the average per consumer of this information to understand it when the experts at best are going to be making faith-based judgments. One more thing, there's a Nobel Prize winner who actually has a degree in psychology. He gave a great talk and he goes, okay, the model I have for thinking is, by the way, this model is completely fake, it doesn't exist, and I don't want you to believe it, but it's useful to believe this model. So even the experts are saying there's a faith-based utility.
Yeah, no, this is true. So what I'd say is when the stakes are really high, sometimes we figure out how to do it. My favorite example is the Fed, okay? So the Fed, they use all these incredible macroeconomic models, right? They have unbelievable amounts of data fed into them. What do they decide? Well, we'll tweak but also we'll tweak the prime rate 0.25% and see what happens, okay? So they obviously don't take those things seriously. They take them as kind of heuristic input into a general kind of understanding of what's going on. So, you know, I think that's the way we have to understand how decisions are going to be. And I totally agree in these socio-technical systems, that's more complicated. Climate change is easy when you just look at the climate. When you try to think about the future of energy use, it completely spins out of control, and the politics are totally inseparable from the analysis. So I agree, and I think, again, to me, that's why we need to think about critical inquiry as something different than specifying rigid cause and effect predictive chains that will allow us to know where we're going to go. That will only lead us to worse errors. So I think it's an institutional matter. We need institutions and participation. One of the things that my colleague Mahmoud, I don't know if you've talked yet, is engaged in, your point about expertise, we have a pretty radical take on that, which is that for a lot of issues, there are no experts, and therefore anyone's view is as good as anyone else's once they know enough to be able to say something that's reasonably enlightened. You know, you get somebody 70% of the way there, and their predictive skill is as good as any expert's.
Just game that out a little bit, you end up, I think, with Sam Huntington's Class of Civilizations. Let's assume that several people step up and develop methodologies that they can adhere to that have utility. There will be a group that is disenfranchised by that process.
Sure.
And you're going to create schism lines. And again, I kind of alluded to this earlier. I do believe the current political climate is a consequence, but it's a consequence of this kind of increasing complexity, and these people are getting stuck behind.
I totally
and all
agree.
they have to do is point to the discrepancies between national experts as part of their confusion. Or
I agree with that. So what does that suggest? To me, one thing it suggests to us is that we need to be a little bit more serious about democratic deliberation. That we need to be a little bit more serious about having multiple voices be part of these big decisions, rather than a few powerful economists, mostly located in the northeastern United States, saying that globalization will lift all ships and you'll be fine. Whoops! Oh, whoops! We made a mistake. So and then an irony, of course, that I'm sure hasn't escaped any of you is that some of the trade policies that Donald Trump is advocating were advocated on the left by anti-globalization activists in the 1990s when they were smashing windows in Seattle, right? So the question of how to bring a broader set of policy ideas into the discussion so that you can have a more pluralistic debate is an institutional challenge. It's what democracy is supposed to be about, but we're having a hard time with it. But just to follow up on one thing we're doing, I'd say it's largely as a demonstration that it can be done, is we bring together, Mahmoud brings together groups of 100 citizens, highly diverse. We've had homeless people and we have bankers and plumbers and scientists to talk about the values and futures that they want around complex technological systems like intervening in climate, like autonomous vehicles, like dealing with the future of the energy mix. And it turns out, they have pretty interesting things to say that are absolutely as legitimate as that of what the experts have to say. This isn't a matter of principle, it's actually simply a matter of fact. And just, there's so much uncertainty that the values people bring to these discussions are every bit as important as some set of facts, which are always selected, right? So I think I need to stop, right? So
Sure. I just wanted to point out that from a science communication point of view, and I think my colleague Darcy, who had to leave earlier, he does science communication as well, and anybody in the education space would agree, you know, and I think issues in creative nonfiction get to this as well. There's one track where you have the deficit model, right? The knowledge deficit model, where if I just spray enough facts at my audience, then it'll be, you know, the work will be done on its own, of its own accord, where if I tell them this information, then they will go in this path and this will be the way. And I think that you were getting at that with the political spectrum, where we had all the reasons to think that it would go this way. And then what we failed to account for was the human factor, or that socio-political factor, or that living system idea that we're talking with Pat. And I think that's the thing, is that how do we get there? Well, what does ECAST and these other participatory models do? They connect people. They bring them together and they say that it's not about necessarily just the spewing of facts. It's not just about what the number is, what it means, what's influencing it, where we go with it and its validity through its value. That is, how do we connect? How are we in this together? And what is it that you want to get out of this, that I want to get out of this, and what's the commonalities there, and how do we get? Because it's the deficit model of just sharing information and thinking, well, it's a foregone conclusion what the course of action is. It's not.
Well, it's wrong. Empirically,
right.
we know.
Exactly.
So, yes. So in this particularly politically divisive moment, we're a little hopefully naive that actually we can demonstrate that it's possible to have civil discussions around these issues among very diverse people. So we'll see.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Always makes us think on overdrive. Next, we have Amy Zalman, and Amy's been very generous to organize activities for us, and I'll let her explain to us what they might be.
So I'm going to put up just a couple of slides as we go. Yeah, it's been sort of great, a segue to have people say to me, a couple of you now that, and it was very kind of you to say that you were, you know, looking forward to what I have to say.
Sorry, Amy. Sorry, Amy.
Sorry, I'm not recording yet.
Sorry, Amy.
Okay.
If it's not recorded, it didn't
I
happen.
know.
Well, I can tell you this workshop will be listening to.
Now, are you going to speak from there?
Well, it is an activity, so.
Okay, so we'll give you that.
So you can think about which of, I guess, two groups you might want. Yeah.
One group could be the group that doesn't care if it says. The other group would be the group that didn't know it was going to say. Which are us.
I actually think that, like, my partner has a crush on Angela from the weather person who does, like, partly NPR and partly, like, Channel 4 or something. It's an intense relationship when she's right and when she's wrong. So how can I just forget this for a moment because I want to not focus on that. So what I was just about to say was that it was nice of you that a few of you said to me that you were looking forward to what I had to say, but this is an activity. So actually, luckily, I'm not going to say very much. You're going to do all the saying and doing for the next hour and a half. So that's one. The other is that what you have said to me has been about narrative, which is fair enough. The name of my company, which is a mouthful, which is changing, is Strategic Narrative Institute. And so it would be fair enough to expect that we were going to do something around story. The place for narrative in my work these days, which is as a futurist, is that if we want to shape or influence the future, we have to tell a different story. And for me, that is not, in its first effect, a communications tool, communications thing. It is, what is the story we tell ourselves about how the future is unfolding? And this actually lasts, all the talks have been relevant, and I'm hoping that you'll get the chance to sort of roll them in. But one of the things that I think that entails when we're talking about systems that already exist has to do with re-narrating the past sometimes. So looking back at 1985, or looking back even further as we keep discovering things about the past, in light of what is emerging, how do we need to go back and actually start a story in a way that's productive, that gets us to connect the past to the future? So this set of activities, number 3, are, like I just said to Katina, they're emergent. I came in with one idea of what I thought this day was, and it had more to do with national security in a very everyday sense in which I often deal with it, and it didn't. And it turned out to have a lot in every single presentation so far to do with, it's been called several things: unintended consequences, terra incognita, I think there were a couple of we just don't knows. So what I wanted to do was provide a framework and an opportunity for thinking about unintended consequences. I came in with a sort of a big thing, and as I heard more and more, there's so much complexity and so much detail and so much richness and so much variety in the ways in which you are talking about data, technology, and the future today that I started to scale back and make this a smaller activity so that you could kind of focus in. So I still have kind of ambitious goals for the next hour and a half. They are one kind of a version of empowerment. The reason why this thing that I'm calling futurism, which I treat as a discipline and really has to do with thinking rigorously, not scientifically, but rigorously the way you would in the humanities about the future. The reason that I like it so much is because when people do think rigorously, and I see it in my students, they realize that they can influence it. So one is empowerment. 2 is to share a couple of frameworks, which may be familiar to you. I've already heard Delphi. I know scenarios are familiar here. And this opportunity to think about unintended consequences as opposed to sort of throwing them out and sort of positing them. So I'll go through what I think we can do together in the next hour and a half. So there's this very simple, and when I say frameworks, these are like back of a cocktail napkin things. They are not science, they are not models, you don't need a computer, you don't need anything. Some of you probably know the person who actually invented this thing called the Futures Wheel. It's Jerome Glenn, might have been part of the OTA at some point. But in any event, he's been around for a while. So all it does is ask you to draw a circle in the middle of something where you have some room to go out and think about an emerging change. I'm going to ask you to think about an emergent technological change, to posit in your group one change, one thing that you think might happen in the future. And I'll give you an example that's not on this. This is actually from Stephen Johnson. It's been mentioned a lot today too. Draw an arrow, take a circle, and ask, what is one potential first-order consequence? What is one direct effect of that change? And then you draw another one, and you ask, well, what's an effect of that second change? And you can play this out, and it's actually a useful, if simple, tool. So the example that sort of easy to throw out is, driverless cars. Let's assume that driverless cars become quite ubiquitous. One of the direct effects that's been posited is certainly less accidents. Less accidents mean that there are fewer road fatalities. That's a direct effect. Fewer road fatalities means that there are fewer organs available for transplant in this country, which is where most people in need of a transplant get them. So that's an unintended consequence of what is of something that doesn't have anything to do with organs in the first place or with the medical field. This example, which I like, has to do with chlorinating city water for the first time, and it has all kinds of sort of second order effects. One of them has to do with playing a small role in making pools very common and ultimately possibly reducing the size of women's bathing suits over the course of like 30 years. So they went from these big voluminous things to something else. So I'm going to ask you to do this exercise in a group, just so you get the chance to think, oh, well, what are the unintended consequences of one kind of change, and maybe draw it from one of the talks today that might happen. Some of the things that Katina talked about in the beginning, the potential ways in which data might be used that Pat talked about. I'm starting to I have all these notes elsewhere, but many were mentioned today. But take a meaningful one. And then in order to order this a little bit, I'm going to propose to you that you categorize the first order effects. I don't have something that I can write on, although I suppose I can just write on my computer and I can put it up there, which is to say, when you think like, what are the effects? You might think, what are the effects in governance and policy? What's a direct effect to the economy? What might be a direct effect to our civic life or to politics? What might be a direct effect to individual experience or daily life? What might be an effect? So you might think of like, what are the different institutional areas in which those effects might take place? So you do that, and I will ask you to go to second or third order consequences if you can. And once you've gotten a circle, and that can be a sort of a design, fast exercise, take a look at it, and then we'll come back together. And I'm going to ask you to provide the rest of us three things. One is, what is one interaction between the second or third order effects that you see? Do you see any potential interaction? The second is, would you please find one positive possibility that you might not have found? And if you want some sort of risk. But the second part of this exercise, in which I'll share another framework with which you may be familiar, will ask you to work with that positive effect as a future state, and then do an activity about what might be needed to innovate, whether that's innovating our paradigms or innovating, something much more concrete in order to reach that state. Is this totally muddy? Okay, so I feel silly dividing you up into groups, I think there are 8, 9 people in the room. So take a big piece of paper, if you want to, Post-its, so that you can kind of work independently together and build that map, and then I will type out a couple of these things so that they don't get totally lost.
Is there a doctor in the house? Is there a doctor in the house?
Every time one of those stories comes up about women musicians not giving fame or something like that, it boils my blood. I'm just like, what is that? Like, I hope that's a good patient on the plane, and you're like, well, not the right yet. Anyway, so there's something like Post-its as well for individual work. What do you? Are we free to come up with? Yeah, I was going to ask if we can pick a topic. Yeah. Do we get any topic as far as our central circle?
Yes, that would be up to you.
Okay, so some kind of innovation.
That you draw from something today.
Sure, some kind of technological innovation.
All right.
I'm Andrew. We've spoken all day.
I'm Mahmood.
Let's go, Mahmood. Thanks for joining us. This guy. So yeah, what do we? I don't know.
You're not joining?
Sorry? I thought I would type out just to get, or is it so clear?
What do we think?
Just to break down the gender, thing we've got here.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Katina.
Technological innovation. I don't know where we want to start. I was anywhere from that, the project being successful.
I was going to say, if we start with something that these guys know, we can have something new. On the other hand, you have less chance to learn from it because you're looking at it so close up. Do you guys know much about Magically? Google Glass?
Google Glass, yeah, as far as the
Thomas Cars is a good one, because we all have the ability to make ourselves into it.
Which one? Driverless cars?
Yeah. That was
You've never heard of that, have you? And I'd be like, solar radiation mediation, something like that. I'm trying to think of things that I've thought of day to day, week to week, and be like, oh, this change occurred, that would throw everything up.
up an interesting one. Have you guys seen some movie about a book that the guy he lived in virtual reality? It just came out like a year ago. Essentially, this idea of Second Life on steroids.
Ready Player One?
Ready Player One. Okay. It's far enough out there. Like
Yeah.
if a VR world became, social media moved to some type of kind of immersive VR type world with some consequences. I don't know. It's just far enough out that's probably outside of all of our domains.
But I think it's a cool idea. I think something along those lines is usually what I'm thinking in terms of like some kind of major technological shift in terms of what your experience of your physical experience is, right? Like going from one social media platform to another, that's kind of all the same thing, right? Going into slightly more like going from text to image to video based, again, same kind of thing. We're just disseminating information in a different form. But something where all of a sudden you're going from not having choice of communication of what it is you intend, but instead acting out. Then that's the major change. This idea of social interaction, like you were saying, immersive.
Haptics,
Yeah. It's like kinesthetic, everything.
It's moved beyond visual, which is one of the problems.
Right. Yeah. And then when you mentioned Google Glass, I think the idea there was the integration of like we already have this and continues to this the obsession with the smartphone and all that, but all of a sudden it didn't even have to detract you from your immediate environment. It was just like an overlay. Contact lenses as a means of digital integration or something. Okay, so we want to do.
You could go with contact lenses and implants, brain implants, and essentially embedded personal computing with an always-on interface. Maybe we're too far out ahead of the headlight there. But
well, let's pick something and hit the ground. So,
there are a couple of things that I don't have any particular expertise, but seem like it's out there. One is like, let's say we have a technology for eliminating mosquitoes.
Okay.
For eliminating ticks, just get rid of them.
Yeah.
If we do, CRISPR might be able to do that.
And then where do we go from I like it. It's more on the biology side. It's gonna,
or what if CRISPR became as common as 3D printers?
Right.
Okay. Because then the downstream consequence could be a writ large. And I think we could actually see how to get from here to there. That's the scary thing. We could probably predict with
things, but okay. So if we were all of a sudden have genetic manipulation at our fingertips, and
I didn't even steal what he's going because I think that'd be like one of the first effects, right? Which is we would see proliferation of solutions to everyday problems. Whether it's constant, but
then that's the point, right? So okay. So then, do we want to then say, one consequence out?
So one consequence of being able to do that is get rid of malaria.
Right, because you don't even have to necessarily get rid of mosquitoes. You would just eliminate their ability to asymptomatically carry the disease. Right. Okay, so then let's say intransmittance of malaria. We'll just say malaria. And then if we come up with a consequence from that, we can think about how growth population, where the areas that are so common.
All right.
So then, from there you're going to get
ride sharing.
so you're going to do pop explosion.
Anything else?
Sorry, my mind keeps going to all these kind of solutions to problems that create new solutions like rabbits and.
That's true. That sounds true.
Oh yeah, like when they were, hey, we brought these rats in to kill all these things. Turns out now we have a rat island we cannot go back to. So regional population taking. Then you're going to have agricultural aspects. But let's say.
But those would be solved. Those could be solved by. I was going to say by transportation solutions.
So what I was going to say was if you
so now we've defined. So first
agricultural stress.
Then you could have drought tolerant new strains being created here.
Right, and that's where I was kind of.
So you get sweet potatoes.
Yeah.
CRISPR.
Yeah. So agricultural
Fish
stress, but then the other thing here would be resilient crops.
Technically, you're supposed to be.
Right. And then see just how and but then this could also cause this.
You'd have cost. I spend a lot of time looking at disruptions of cost curves. You'd probably have disruptions of.
Let me just tell you, they write off the back.
Because there'd be turmoil because even if the promise
Sugar cane
so much
becomes cheaper.
people who have to make longer regular investments start pulling those back because they're afraid that they're going to be disrupted. Then you have capital.
Would it be traffic impacts?
That's right.
Yeah.
I was surprised. You're not
Something about
referring.
just let me think about it.
Sure.
You tell us not
Reduction in in investment in sort of non-growing ways.
I know in Virginia you are for.
Yes, synthesis rather than so you go from synthetic.
Yeah, fabricated food.
Yeah, so then you could have Brazilian crops and you can also have synthetic food.
Yeah.
But basically what
I
you're
was
saying.
thinking less, as one effect on this, just less investment.
Got it.
Say, oh, well, we can grow it, then why should we?
So it's called lane issues?
Okay.
As one, think of both
Disruptions of
features.
Because of the because not just commodity disruption, but instead an actual market shift because you have an increased demand
So a drone flight free
to like you don't have to account for someone else.
Urgency is
You produce where it's needed, and then that way that transit.
shopping delivery. So
Yeah.
if this existed,
Right, yeah.
if this existed,
Yeah.
parallel things that show up at the same time. So for example, where I'm going with this is personalized
So
filtering.
lane issues.
Based upon genetic profiles. If this existed, this doesn't actually help my little brain. Yeah, I'm Irish, so we don't. In fact, we don't know. So stop us from talking. But I don't know that this solves us with growing specific foods that help us with nutrition directly.
Traffic
Imagine that
top level traffic behavior.
super cheap at this time. And the interpretation of that from a nutritional perspective would be like infinite number of diets. So then personalized nutrition. There might be micro markets for certain crops based upon
Because now, the fact that your market is 1,000 people.
Wait, you want another bubble here?
just super low cost rice.
Okay.
No, yeah, so you
Like,
want to.
I think it might be helpful to have traffic called out, traffic behavior.
Which would be.
I am struggling with
So we had
metro ridership.
synthetic.
The second order issue is that it would be direct effect.
And we're still sticking.
So like
David's asking us to do different areas, right? So this would be like medical or something like that.
This affects
And this
traffic
would
and
be
it lowers traffic.
Yes.
ecological, populational.
That's right.
But then we got into
You
agricultural,
change
and nutritional, very quick. And then
On
economics.
another
What
race.
about governance or policies or anything
Or
like that?
That becomes really interesting.
the wider sidewalks.
Yeah.
Okay.
This city.
So okay, so no, that's a good thought because let's say we were presuming here that everything that was
But we
directly
are putting
worked,
down widening
right?
from 66.
What if one of the unintended consequences is actually
Okay, so
And you might close it if you're downtown.
put the base in the wrong spot? Didn't realize this because it was a
that's a
two-part system.
Law of large numbers, that's what we have to do here. Which means that there will be a million. Which means not that it may be. Large numbers, there will not only be an epidemic, there will be a lot of bad consequences.
Like,
So
The guy who injected himself with a CRISPR for diabetes and apologized for it.
But what?
Nothing bad.
But we just said that
He
they would
realized it was kind of
make downtown green,
setting a bad
green,
example for
block them off the traffic.
like the one that uses a 3D printer to make it go. Just like
Biohacking, there's personalized biohacking now. The guy who
No
magnets
requirement
his
for
fingertips,
as we
in it.
Right.
So
You can
we
actually
change
detect
the way
current
the
flow, like if you're an electrician, you can actually put your hand to the wall and detect current flow by putting rare earth magnets in your finger. Just like essentially, you go to a tattoo
Instead of trying to do every causal chain one to one,
with this, we can guarantee that.
and then there will be a lot of things that.
now we're talking because now we actually Oh, man.
You want this to be perfectly true.
Yeah, exactly. So we could, so if we were to say,
There's the whole bulletproof coffee group that people who are trying to be like
Gene
top
doping.
so we have self-harm, and then, what's, self-augmentation?
self-augmentation.
Yeah.
And these are mutually exclusive.
I was thinking like
They
population
never-
density, how that might.
Oh, yeah.
Home
Okay, so,
prices.
yes, now what do you want off this? Or what do you want to do?
Usain Bolt now is, just.
Maybe zoning?
regular
Yeah,
joke.
zoning.
That would really.
So now to governance. So one of the things that I do is think about defining moments where
30 seconds ago I asked
things-
you. So I have to go back. I don't think you can do this.
Population density.
A policy, I wasn't predicting that.
You weren't.
But I was saying, a situation like that would be an
No,
opportunity to reflect
there are many
person to
answers.
person. Consider an opportunity.
Yeah, I like it.
You can look at
And
these
you
and
should.
come up
I
with
love it. We're already
narratives.
putting
Narratives is
each
just a
other.
word that I spend a lot of time thinking about, so that's why I was.
Yes.
What would be the bad thing that could happen here that
I'm gonna signify.
that could become a PR momentum that would then lead to the social
No, I think that's
support
going on.
policies that would be competing with the narrative of these things. And so we can kind of try to envision which way that could go, and we could
When I was
try both
16,
ways, but
the day you turn 16.
They're from year to year.
Waiting to get a license. Yep.
Right, and
Yeah.
enough of it, like, I see what you're saying,
people trying to do
create a new need
End up doing this.
policy.
yeah, like 10 years after it gets introduced, it's the
They get
limit-
cancer.
the limit
Yeah.
on savings kind of thing.
Okay. So what, how can we sum that up and indicate, because I think the policy aspect, I think the idea of the technological disruption.
There we go, living proof, right here in front of us. Never would have happened.
It's a perception problem.
You have the technological disruption,
So as people do this, does that, and then it blocks
So
this.
when you got your license, you didn't.
right, because then you end up having a policy response. Because it is, you synthesize a new market of demand of governance over a problem that previously.
But play that chess game in one policy arena, call it the US.
I learned in
No.
where the roads
That won't block other markets from doing this.
Right.
Now you've got a geopolitical problem because these people are.
It's now it's a new nuclear race.
Right, and well, it's not even a nuclear race, it's a nuclear race against somebody who's not armed with nukes because they've now tied their.
Well, right, but that's the thing, is that would the policy then backtrack?
Exactly.
Because, yeah. So Space Force is what we're saying in the end?
Is this going the direction you wanted this to go, or are there elements of this exercise?
Well, I think it's interesting, we're grad students, I would say, do you want to drop out and not close this down so quickly? Do you want to keep what's been going with what?
Yeah.
Sizing of sidewalks, alternative transportation lines.
Well, I mean, the next thing for me is speciation, which most people think that I'm making an argument for post-human, and I'm not. I'm making.
I'm not sure if it goes there. You might plan to have this dedicated lane.
Cancellation or traditional evolution, but here you.
I was thinking of all of these right now.
I mean, I know we already talked about this.
Yeah.
All of them.
But
I'm doing
follow it out.
I'm doing multiple. I'm doing multiple generations.
Right, yeah.
We read by the hour. Yeah.
Because that also, that's the other thing, then you get into the Lamarckian idea of, like, well, acquired traits aren't going to be inherited, but if you can make it so that, yeah.
They can still be transmitted in non-genetic form, right?
Right.
So
So here you have, I think that ultra labs.
I spent a lot. I actually have the domain name because it's like we don't need.
You're like, oh, by the way, that's trademarked.
No.
No, it's just service mark.
No. I was like, we're at something new, and it's like, oh, we don't have to eat really. We need to
Right.
procreate.
Yeah.
We're moving beyond. You don't need legs. You can have legs that switch in and switch out for running a policy response. And there's a point at which.
I don't know when.
I mean, if we could, I guess there's only,
There's always pushback from people.
policy response and say,
Yeah, almost early.
Yeah.
You can almost imagine the 3D printing down
Every year they
right,
tell
that
people
this
who
gets
are-
introduced, some breakthrough creates it, has it downloadable.
But a lot of people, like one of my friends,
buy
who's
a
a life
kit from
also
him with
has
supplies for something you can't 3D print. and then people say they don't regulate it because they don't move fast enough. One of these things starts to happen,
Put it on the bus.
and then they begin to regulate it early. Or later.
I like the models in terms of. It's a good one to bring in. Well, it's a good one to bring in because then you get away from this, you know, what base have for an image of human, and then you're getting away from what that means. So
you have a predictable demographic response too. Right? I don't mean to take away from this, but as I was thinking about religion, I'm like, well, it depends on which denomination. And I was like, no, it really depends on which age within, because the 25 and unders are going to be looking at this more favorable, similar to they do towards sexual orientation, more exchange. So it's the same thing. I see schisms within religions. Within
want to put ownership as a
Yep. I would do separate things. And you could have, you know, we see a current rising atheist population, but then you could end up having backlash in return to faith because then you start seeing elements and people start telling stories about, you know, how this is representative of, you know, a different kind of flood or something like that.
Here's a big one. Kurzweilian or the extended lifespan.
Yeah.
Which is
Kurzweil.
Kurzweil.
No, what I'm saying, you said Kurzweilian, but I'm saying, so
like,
Ray Kurzweil, he spoke at my,
so if one of the self-enhancements, or maybe it wasn't even self-enhancements, maybe it's a function of all these others, was 200-year lifespan, you got a lot of downstream impacts from that.
Well, yeah, and it's just like we were like, oh, it's ending malaria, and then we quickly got to like the world just
the rats and snakes on that. Right.
One black suitcase and then some other awkward bracket, which I think was a little like that was, you know, one of those punch bikes.
That's
When you we've accumulated a lot of stuff, and we own all our stuff, whereas the younger people, these journalists were saying, well,
you could see
mobile now.
It's actually all from something else because I don't know.
We've got a fourth or fifth.
You know, there'd be enough hint here of these things.
Desire to own property.
Okay.
All it can take is one story about a potential.
You don't even need a story.
Yeah,
They're already lined up.
They're already
churches.
lined up.
My students have actually done a diagram. The Muslims have churches positions.
But there would be no
evangelical Christian churches.
There would be a new church. There would be a
church.
Oh,
absolutely. Have you read the story of B and
or the
Ishmael?
Cults that develop around, you know, ideas of beauty, ideas of longevity. It would be a traditional reaction. They would reject the churches, which they see as backwards or whatever. They would be, their compass would be spinning, and they'd be looking for some orientation. So they find affinity, find people, and then they just kind of create group there.
Yeah, I mean, all it took was wanting to get one divorce.
That's a good case. Walking and texting.
Yes. Literally, just all of a sudden, it's like, the world is not different. Yeah, no, it's easy to send I write upside down for a living, so.
Because they were like, it should be much higher.
This has to, we're never supposed to finish it, right? This is our life.
Well, so
this is all we do.
One thing, except I shouldn't write it.
Have you noticed at night, I see it in dark night.
But I was thinking personalized nutrition, then rejection of.
Okay, so wait a minute, we're calling this.
The whole idea of using nutrition because you just didn't work or whatever, just kind of total rejection of the scientific approach to nutrition.
And then we want
backlash. It goes the next step out.
Okay.
That backlash would be a lot.
Synthetic foods.
So you're thinking like the Orgo crowd? Organic?
Well, I'm thinking GMOs for example here, right? Or the God, caffeine was good yesterday and bad today. Why do I even read this stuff?
So a rejection of those that profess the value of what God is. Okay.
Neil had a kind of a paleo lifestyle writ large. I've seen some of those scenarios.
So you could end up having both of these actually.
Yeah. It's like collapse of the world order.
No, I'm just
Think about it.
Nihilism.
So collapse the world order would require an
The
change.
30-year-olds just shouldn't be on the scooters, but that's partially thing. They're on the main road, they're not on the footpath.
I don't see a threat happening here except for certain countries collapse of the agricultural thing. So how would the U.S. threat posture, right? And I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just trying to think of the mechanics. How would the U.S. government collapse of
And
this?
away from looking what's
No, it's because it's asymmetric warfare, right? Because this is
just
just
that survival.
anybody, right?
So
So you don't have you don't control the power anymore.
So do you think nation states then end up falling and you would get?
And to what extent they push all of this is dependent on.
So think about how you get there. So this moves fast, government moves slow. This moves so fast that government response will feel ineffective. People don't trust in federal government. And essentially a life in anarchy because this is moving so fast the government. I'm just trying to think of a scenario.
how to do it, it's okay.
Well, or another, not unlike this scenario, this is picked up in some countries and not in others.
Absolutely.
Europe says no, the US says maybe as long as it's an embryo. And China says, oh, it's okay for everybody, right? And they start making all the money and...
Black markets.
Custom drugs.
Oh yeah, the drug market. Because now we're not even talking substance or things.
So it had to press the
That
brake.
organism.
I said, lucky you.
Drugs.
Lucky my son.
But you know,
He's not that
think
tall.
about, you know, instead of having to even go the route of harvesting mushrooms or psilocybin and then going that route or something like that, you could end up synthesizing, you know, easily habitable bacteria or something like that that just basically feeds whatever.
Your guys' roles in the future under this. I mean, I'm already seeing a lot of people, like, I don't consider myself to be at the office of an expert anymore when I go to, I consider my doctor to be a retail person that I have to go in almost armed with as much information. I know it's the whole Google goes to see the doctor, but under this scenario, the doctors are going to have a hard time keeping up with a fragmented, never-changing thing. Either under one scenario, people, they rise. They
Then we fix the bigger problem.
I wonder if how the medical establishment changed.
So I think led by health can also be personal injury as a byproduct.
You know, that's interesting because, yeah, it's actually, that's a
So right now there's no regulation really.
framework now is we do
Oh,
this.
that's independent laws. So we're going to make that.
Goes through FDA.
Right, but you don't, I mean, you don't.
Or is trying to sell that idea right now.
For being a drug.
This is basically saying,
Well,
we're not going to do that because I actually want to treat my diabetes.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to sell my house.
And I've done my own research on Google.
That's right. I'm going to just go do it.
I read the papers.
So I'm going to completely undermine.
So, I'll just say this to both groups, I don't want to
Right.
time.
That framework just
So in the
throw out
next
this crap.
5 minutes, this is gonna be a challenge. Find.
Pointing at the guys, come
Find.
on.
Well, no, because I've seen what's on that. Find something that's actually a vision, some small part of the world where something good happens, and that's something that you would be interested in.
Now that's so
Yeah, if you can't do that, then find something that you think is an inevitability.
Okay, so
If you can't, either find something good, it's a vision you can work toward,
In malaria,
or find
yes,
something that
that's
you think
good.
is inevitable that you must adapt to.
So find an impoverished country that has
Alright.
social malaria
So,
today,
there we go.
that has gross
One thing that would be great
in the world, and just sort of this agriculture, and we don't really understand the food crisis.
Yeah.
alternative transportation
you
enabled.
reduce the medical costs that they're paying.
They're growing crops, they have more
They
equal
can't,
food for the rest
they
of the
ride,
world.
maybe they ride you together. It's cheaper to go with 3 people in the car than.
But there's probably.
Right now, most people don't click the ride share on the lift or.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, a lot of Southeast
Even to save $10.
I like helping people.
You know, mosquito net.
Sorry, you don't.
manufacturers will go bust.
It depends on the time of day.
Yeah. Alright, so
Alright.
let's follow this
So,
straight. So
I like
we have
Zach's
a billion
things. Have we written that down somewhere?
impoverished
That,
people
yeah,
who
building a sense of community.
cognitive power was spent surviving. And we've added a cognitive surplus to the world.
It's probably like a third or fourth
of people who are now healthy, well-fed, and have some
It only
access to
happens if you've got changes in population density.
So we have an increase in cognitive surplus. And that's before I get into those issues. I'm just trying to say, what's the, take those extreme things and switch them all to positive, that would be
closer together.
So we have Congo, Harvard and Congo, right? That's the next step here.
So yeah,
it certainly reduced the U.S. government's
yeah, you had to
importance
change
of foreign aid.
Yeah, exactly.
Take Uber or whatever.
Yeah.
And China stepping into that. Which switched now, so that would maybe the hegemon of U.S.-China relations changes under this.
Yeah. So if someone's already talking.
So let's say if there is this, then this times that. And let's say
But really the only time I would take like a
with this, because we're separating out the two, positives come and somehow, like even if it's increased lifespan, okay, that's going to sustain us.
I had the same sense this morning when I ordered. And I was
so
thinking,
you think positively there, but
that's what I was thinking.
not necessarily posting them like you were saying,
Community, and
but
I think
that
maybe
gets
social activities.
to an area
Who was
that
it
Chris
talking
will
about
speak
barbecues?
to.
Oh, you see, yeah, getting that call at the barbecue.
You can almost take kind of a libertarian.
I like the idea of like they're creating social clubs or
Right.
They go libertarian,
and they let people die.
But
Then
that previously we had through organized religion, for instance,
but
and now we're going to have those
basically
en masse because people don't really attend.
eligible for
Okay, and you just need someone like
so what do we want
right
to
here.
be? Okay, so how about this? If you're saying this is a problem,
Well, they were looking in Phoenix to have a shuttle down from the suburbs where people do need to because there is no alternative transport. There is no transit.
Congo, because
So if
trying
you're
to think about, well, we went very quickly from saying, gosh, you cure.
got four colleagues that live near you.
We're in fact,
Scooter ride, you'll meet them, and you may not talk to them at work because they're in other section, but
the circuit for doing that is actually
and you hang out.
the affluence. And can we short circuit the
You might
having
discuss
too many
business
kids
things. You might discuss personal.
problem?
Most likely, you won't be discussing.
Not go down that pathway, but go another pathway.
Sort of that's going on now is in San Francisco. There are lots of up-and-down technology people that work which is a good.
So the hour of
Yeah.
this, and then this takes their surplus capital and thinks strategically and starts investing in education.
Or maybe they do, or maybe somebody else does.
Oh, I
but
was
we-
just
So
I'm a strategist. That's what I'm like. How do you make a buck out of this? You launch this, you know the downstream impacts, and then you
healthier.
I mean, they always have Wi-Fi, very nice, but towards your like hours for the day. Yeah, I mean, if it's such a long ride when you're
As
working.
opposed to that.
Higher investment in education.
And then you have.
And I think they know that, so by giving you a way to
increase.
they're getting. I know
They're giving
this.
free food, too.
Remember when we
Yeah,
free laptop, free internet connection?
The only thing I would push back on.
I was going to think like increase value of
No. Is unhappy.
Oh, great, you can work it. You can work tomorrow in the morning, you know?
For the hour that you're not sitting at work.
But it's true, that's what's happening.
Think about the things you're doing.
Non-work things.
Whatever.
Yes.
Okay. It's sort of really
increase value of life.
now, like anyone who likes to
higher
do it,
Yeah.
Can we regroup and,
Yes. Yes.
so we can get to the second part of this? This looks
Yes.
amazing.
Thanks for
Amy,
My
do you want
group-
to turn around?
We'll just
Never
keep
did
talking
it.
to each other.
That's like one thing I've learned.
Yeah,
I'll go back to
Smart
mine.
We're supposed to choose our favorite positive.
So because there are two groups, it's sort of like a little team off, but we'll share with you and you can share with us. And then I'll go on to the second part. There's another part of this. I was given 2 hours.
Okay. Actually, I need to make sure that I check the time too. So what we came up with initially was desktop CRISPR. So in the event.
I thought they were talking about cooking innovation.
So in the event we were to democratize the ability to synthesize anything genetically that came to mind, We then went on to say, initially we were very cheery and wide-eyed and said, and malaria. We could just basically engineer mosquitoes to no longer harbor the virus. And then we, from there, quickly just got super sad. And said, okay, so then what, that would mean a regional population explosion in some underdeveloped parts of the world, and then you end up having agricultural stress. And then we realized, okay, maybe we should stop going that direction. Let's come up with something else. And we went a more positive route and said, what about resilient crops, though, so that you could alleviate the agricultural stress? And then we got immediately back to dark place and said, well, then you'd have commodity disruption, because now things that were of great value because they're harder to grow are easier, and therefore you have disruption there. But then we also went in the direction of personalized nutrition, because now you don't have to, whatever your specific needs are, you can generate that food as needed. And then same thing with synthetic foods and just foregoing agriculture in general. And then we thought there could be potential backlash where people, if they weren't on board with this, would then reject the realms that supported it, like science and nutrition. And then we went the more movie-favorable directions of self-harm and self-enhancement. Self-harm, we tried to circle back to a positive and say, well, you're probably going to get a population large enough that would push for a policy response of some kind. So then you would potentially tamp down on negative aspects of this democratized CRISPR. And then in the self-enhancement direction, we said, okay, you're going to live longer, and that could be positive because you have the abilities to make that quality of life good. And then a cool thing that Pat had brought up was this ultra-biological change, where now all of a sudden what it means to be human and all of that, like, it just changes entirely. And Amy also contributed this idea of like an aesthetic perspective changes what's beautiful and what is pursued for to be attained. And then once Amy gave us the second prompt about pick a direction that could be potentially positive or whatever, after the end malaria, we said, okay, well then you're going to actually potentially have a decrease, not a regional population explosion, but a decrease in the birth rate, because with lower young mortality, you tend to not need to have as many kids. And so then you could have an increased value of life, the attainment of education, that kind of thing. And now you've risen areas of the world that right now are what we consider impoverished, but they would, through self-sustaining means, have a better chance to compete on the global scale. So, and then we also tried to address, Mahmoud talked about potential religious backlash. Could be another aspect to it because of the culture situation. And then also potentially sidestepping drug companies, because you would no longer need to go with your big Novartis or other drug company solutions. You can treat yourself with stuff. So so a lot of different things, but there's some glimmers of hope and positivity and optimism. So questions? Not a lot to take in at all. What did you guys come up with?
We Googled it, by the way.
What do you guys have?
It's like a sing-off in those movies.
Riff off? Yeah. I saw Pitch Perfect.
You presented? Yeah, Helen, you're presenting. You're going to present.
Oh, I'm going to present.
You're going to present? I would love you to.
All right. So we did not choose a soon-to-be technology. We chose one that actually is here and what are sort of more enhanced. Alternative urban transportation, which we just...
the same as ours.
Scooters, drones, bikes, e-bikes, AVs, motorized wheelchairs, and ride chairs of all types. So then we looked at some of the issues around it. First issue we thought of were lane issues, like scooters on the sidewalks, knocking off old ladies, urban planning issues, traffic, community, legal issues, regulations, we would need more with that, as well as health issues. And then some of the third level things were with urban planning, we'd have changes in zoning, population density, people want to be closer together so they can scooter around. It would affect how we would change the building of roads and parking lots. This urban planning still gets back into the lane issues as well. With community, there was a real feeling that people who were scootering around or even taking ride shares end up talking to people who they might not talk with. So that gets you into potential communities that are organized in different ways and new social activities. Of course, biking or walking, they're health issues. There are two ways to look at it. One is it's positive and there are more steps, more fitness, etc. The other way is you're scootering, you're walking down the sidewalk and you get knocked over by a scooter not paying attention. Most of these technologies are rentals by the minute, the hour, etc. So the question is, previously when people would buy cars or buy bikes, you'd own them outright or lease them on a long-term lease, not by the minute, but by the year. What if so we think this might affect other things, either individuals, businesses who are in the rental and sale business, as well as mass transit. If you can rent technology, are you going to use mass transit? So those are the issues that we kept thinking about. Question, yeah.
This makes me think of when Elon Musk came up with his Hyperloop idea, right?
Oh, we didn't get into that one.
Right, that's fine. So what it actually, something came up about the history of transportation, like in that discussion, and it made me look into other articles about like what's the average commute over the past several centuries, right? And if you actually go back to the original construction of Rome, so things were often circular and everything just because it just made sense, right? You had a nexus point, you had a center, and you built out from that. Cities were often essentially a 20 to 25 minute walk from wherever, from end to end, from wherever you needed to go. Like, so if you lived in the center, it was like a 20 to 25 minute radius on the outside. And then sure enough, nowadays, even with cars, if you actually look at the densest areas and the most commonly traveled, it's a 20 to 25 minute drive. And then you get into a 20 to 25 minute train ride. And so the introduction of new methods of transportation absolutely completely shift, your urban planning, but even how beholden you are to where you want to work and where you want to live, what you're going to do in that time, how much more you read, and therefore how much more information capital you actually have in your decision making. Like, it just completely changes everything. So I think this is a really cool, sneaky technological disruptor that we maybe haven't given enough credence to.
Yeah, we did talk briefly. So if you had one of these dense areas, say DC, what would happen if in several years we decided, these 27 blocks, no cars. You'll only be able to get around by scootering or biking or driving. I mean, not driving, walking.
Right.
And you completely eliminated cars. Well, if you did that, how would it change things?
You might have, don't mean to use this term, a different kind of clash of civilizations, because based upon your mode of transportation, so terminus was the god of boundaries back in Rome. So you really have all these people with different terminus, right? I have my walking terminus, I have my Hyperloop terminus up to Boston, and so you have all these different people mixing and matching depending on whether they're mixing and matching at work or church or education or some other thing. So just the different cultures interacting in the same area based upon their transportation.
Yeah. Because then those communities have a stake in policy in that area even too. So all of a sudden you start caring about what you may not have cared about before in Massachusetts, because now you're like, well, I go there 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And it affects me. So yeah, it's a really neat exercise. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, it was.
Cool. Well, we're not done. So, yeah, because I was given all this time. So I thought that was amazing. And what I actually liked is that one of these was sort of quite discrete, and the other was sort of very expansive. So you can do this in multiple ways. The second part of this, and this is me sort of putting together a couple of different frameworks. This is not my own. It is, to me, sort of narrative and constructive, ultimately. Is anybody familiar with this 3 horizons? Not McKinsey's. So there's a group of policy futurists in Scotland, which used to have a parliamentary kind of section dedicated to doing foresight. And over time, working often with like either ecosystems, like the health ecosystem in, you know, Edinburgh, Glasgow or something, or policy, they came up with this way of talking about how to shift large systems from the present to the future. And it's so intuitive. It's really attractive. And what they said was, like, even though people say they do, or that some people don't think about the future, some people do, they said, well, actually we all do, all the time. We just do it in a few different registers. And there are these, or horizons. And these are sort of both personality types and ways in which systems consider the future. The first horizon, they say, is that routine system on, you know, what keeps things going every day. If you have any version of large system, it has some processes that need, right, continuity all the time. They don't just disappear. That kind of person is the one who eats the same thing for breakfast, right? You know, they are all about routine. The third horizon is, this is what I was trying to produce in this, is where we go. And the other thing about this first horizon is it's eventually going to become obsolete. It's what's passing. It is the data regime that you were talking about this morning, which is going to pass so fast that we won't even have time, that was you, to start figuring out some of the ethical questions that we think are so public. Eventually, it's going to go away. Pictures are going to go away, audio is going to be whatever, short term. The third horizon is that visionary space. So people associate people with that. That's wherever he is at this point, Elon Musk, or that system that is eventually going to rise, because history goes like that. What's coming into being that we need, that is coming, whether they're ready for it or not, whether the U.S. federal government is ready for it or not, this world of, you know, a different kind of geopolitical arrangement is coming. And so where is it that we either want to be or are going to be, and need to sort of think about that. And that's like the visionary personality. And then they say there's this second horizon, and they like this. This is the base, they say, of innovation and of entrepreneurship. That's where one figures out, how is the system going to keep doing its back office work and going to keep doing the things it needs to do, because you don't turn over an inherited system over time, while preparing for the third. What are the innovations or adaptations that are required in the meantime? So simple example of that, although you're all nodding your head, but is the hybrid vehicle. How are we going to get from the, you know, the gasoline sort of regime to the electric vehicle, if that is where we're going, if it's not here? Well, there's some modifications or innovations in between. So my proposal for the last part is to actually play with this a little bit and to figure out what's your third horizon from those two. What's the idea? Where would we like to go if we're going to have desktop CRISPR? Where would we like to go? And then to come up in a group with one, and then the first horizon for now will be our real world right now with all of its flaws and wonders. And so what is one kind of innovation that we probably need or could use that will help us shift from where we are, but what's going away, which is no CRISPR, or, you know, cars plus emergent transportation, into that three that we desire. And to me, innovation could be technical, could be process, could be sort of policy, also could be, I'll call it paradigm. You know, what's the heavy duty, somebody this morning used myth, sort of mythic structure that we need to change, you know, from monarchy to democracy, or whatever it is in this case. So that's the proposal for the second part of this, for about 20 minutes, is to come up with an innovation, or is to come up with the third horizon that you like, and an innovation or idea that helps us make our way there, sort of as a society.
Where do we want to get, and which vehicle would get us from where we are to that, but would eventually go away itself.
So essentially tactically planning out.
Yeah. So if we wanted to go this route of, you know,
this is an attractive way to spend 20 minutes.
And more people in it.
Would we have zero carbon emissions? Is that our aim? And therefore
Yeah.
people don't own their own car?
So you could have things like
Well,
Except for a hobby
zero,
car.
I mean, this
Currently we
assumes that you
have
get electricity free.
pandemics.
I mean, most of these, many of these
just in general,
run on
whatever the
electricity,
epidemic
not
of
ride shares, but.
And the electricity could be produced using a lot of carbon.
As
well.
I forget what our mix is.
So if we have pandemics and epidemics in our first horizon,
It's not 100% renewable. I mean, that's, I want to say Arizona just hit 100% renewable, or am I imagining that? Maybe.
I was,
I think so. We should be putting solar
if I was
everywhere.
consulting,
They've got a lot of nuclear.
I would tell them
Yeah.
before they launched
I'm not sure of the number. I
to
can't say.
identify a
Anyway,
positive.
I was in Iceland,
I think
they're
the horizon,
100%.
Actually, I'm thinking second horizon
hydro-
makes sense,
Hydro
which is
and geothermal.
launch with
Volcanoes have a lot.
like second base in mind.
right?
Launch with like 2 or 3 partners that are likely to generate positive
Sorry.
benefit. Launch
One third
and
way that I
announce
would like
each 2
is if
benefits
there's
as case study references.
A lot of
so
new
that
technologies
you
are just
have
fortunately
positives
used
ahead of
by those who have a lot of wealth.
Now I'm just thinking
And if you look at people who are using these scooters or using
might
Uber,
benefit from
probably
those
some wealthier. They're not the
things
people who are
like
working
Robert Wood
in the
Johnson
back of a kitchen in a
Foundation
restaurant.
partners with this company
And if there's
before
some
they
way to sort of
launched
push
to
all of this
fund
towards
I
more
guess what I'm
equitable
trying to think is I'm actually
nice.
starting at kind of the far left and
So right now, the yellow taxi
towards the
cab,
middle,
non-ride
and now if we
share,
jump to the
cabbies
end
are
and work
earning
back,
between
what do we
$40 and
find?
$50
In other
the
words,
upper
what's
limit
third
per
and
day.
fourth base from
Rent
a
per day,
successful
per day.
product launch of an ecosystem?
And I happened to
Yeah,
be
no, it
picked
does.
up
That's
by
right,
a
because I
yellow
launched
taxi cab
ecosystems
sales
from,
manager.
Where I launched this,
Said,
I would
"Hi,
try and plan that out.
you know,
And if
I
we're
was with my
thinking of the
kids.
third horizon, how do we work
We're riding
backwards to
yellow
connect
cab.
it all
I
up?
said, yeah, you guys usually take between 1 and 2
So
hours
I
to get
think
to us,
that
even though we're about 300 meters from your
to
office in Tempe.
kind of biological.
And he said, yeah, you know, we have so many contracts, we're giving them out to Uber and Lyft.
You want to think
6,000 or so
my
government
head,
contracts that they can't actually do because they have no drivers to drive.
out of those people that now
So
are
all
alive
the
that
drivers
previously-
who can are going to
What,
Uber
how do
and
I
Lyft.
want to capitalize?
Yet even
What
Lyft
do I
drivers
think
are
that
not
they're
paid
going to
that much
contribute? How
per
do I
day.
want to capitalize on that?
The
And
first Lyft driver, who was a veteran,
So launch
who
is sort of
picked us
like,
up, said that their first day
humanitarian
of 10.5 hours was
that
also
here's
$40.
CRISPR.
So it
We're
seems
gonna launch
like
it.
How much?
$40. These are people who
We're
have
gonna launch it
pride and don't want to be
worldwide,
unemployed,
but
so they
with
want to stay home and
crowdsourced
do nothing.
campaign
So they'll do
targeted
nothing,
at
inverted commas,
addressing
and earn
these
$40
big
for working
problems.
8 to 10 hours, which is
Yeah,
astronomical.
yeah,
So the
yeah,
yellow
yeah.
cab driver says to me, I'm going to get you in touch with
because
our
you can
CEO. I was
basically,
like, good,
like
you should
we were
do that.
talking
You know, come and
about
visit our
education and all
university.
that changing.
So they had this email exchange with me, and they
You
said to
could
me,
come
what do
in
you
and
think we can do to
basically
get more
say,
drivers? I said, just pay them more.
Mm-hmm.
Forgo the rental of $135 a day.
Apprenticeships,
So we have a
jobs
transition
programs,
problem,
and training,
which is an opportunity as well.
so
So the Waymos of this world are going to require training drivers.
like a bare bones infrastructure of that.
The yellow
while
cab
doing
companies
this,
are
you're
going to have
basically
to
saying
transition
immediately,
to be
hey, by the
competitive.
way, since you're not
The only reason they're competitive now is because they don't pay
preoccupied with
wages.
then, you
Lyft
know,
is not
you know,
either.
It would be great a book.
You know,
Uh,
paying
like
very
Bill and
well.
Melinda Gates
And
Foundation.
yet, sort of a younger generation is going to Lyft those drivers. They can
Right.
speak excellent English, communicate. Some of them are students, some of them are between jobs, blah, blah, blah. So what is the opportunity, what is the innovation we're going to have to make the yellow taxi cab company competitive with the Waymos and Uber and Lyft?
Right.
And what are we going to do? Are we going to transition those drivers who are earning hardly anything now to the rideshare
goods can come out of this
AVs,
process,
because they're
then
going to require training drivers for at least a couple of years, just so that there's a... I'm trying to think of a process whereby our workers will not be out of work
outcomes
as the AVs come in and have a negative impact on the workforce.
What are the positive outcomes? If you can articulate that,
Right.
It's
Then
very
you
hard
can
for a business
also
that, you know, used to
proactively
be successful,
kind of
yellow
meet
cab.
Yeah,
but
to
the more
transition to
decision
something
making though,
very
in all
different.
of this
And I
is,
say this
you need a
because
stable regulatory
I
environment.
previously had a job
Telling you
selling advertising
not to cross
for,
the lines that
company that was failing. And,
you
you know,
know,
so
what
like
is
a
this?
company that's failing.
Well, you know we're not
and
going
it
to
was-
get. Oh, go ahead.
And
Well, I mean, I was in that space too. Like the
it
discussion was
requires
starting
real vision and leadership on the
Genetic,
management. And I don't know yellow cab from
was
Oklahoma.
right. What's to be done?
So,
about the fact that there's
I mean, I just think it's really difficult So I was selling advertising for a company at the time when I left called Super Media, but their flagship product was the Verizon Yellow Pages, which is basically the dead product if it's not dead.
Yeah, but not from scratch, from the real world.
That's exactly.
So.
We have failing
Anyway,
crops
it's
and we
basically
have
a dead product.
So
before you went to market, management knew that they heard about the internet. It wasn't like it was news, but they couldn't figure out how to take their assets.
You're going to
salespeople who sell things to local businesses
generate the results
into selling something different than
you're finding NGO partners
and it just takes a lot of vision and it's very hard.
Well, it's essentially a political problem. Which is
you do that you've just solved their problem for them. Then you ask them to go downstream and deploy their new resources. They can redeploy their resources downstream. In doing that,
there are enough people who are much higher
board here. I would say we have to anticipate. Now, this is the positive things that we can affect. Right. When we come to market,
you don't have
what successes launch at the same time and partnerships that are catalyzed and mobilized right away. We can then immediately predict that there'll be bad things to happen. We would then have to develop
in what direction
response plans to those in places that have bad regulatory environments.
Solves
So
that problem.
we would have not the Pope, but people on hand.
Individual businesses, meaning they can
not necessarily speak against it, but to provide. I don't know, but
$12
if I was to try and game plan
$15,
this out,
right.
I wouldn't try and presume
bottom
that
end
would happen. I would try to
wages
maximize all the good things that I want to happen through partnerships, so I'm not spending a lot of capital. Then I would anticipate to the extent that I could the two or three big things that could happen.
The higher end,
try and plan tactics
people who are making
such that the net impression of this was, wow, this is succeeding at firing all every time something bad happens, they kind of, we're not going to anticipate everything, but maybe we can, I don't know, that's
paying her $50 an hour.
I mean,
you
get
paying her $85 now. You can just do that.
Just thinking of like what's the
for her
silver bullet for each of the problems,
especially when you add
you're going to have religious backlash.
just cleaning. And that's the way it is throughout the economy. You have people at the top end saying no, but then in fact, when they do it,
crop issues
when
and
you see
agricultural
is you
issues,
see
food supply issues or whatever,
consumer power
the region
at the bottom
and
end,
move elsewhere.
which is better for
basically
businesses
say
like
we can
supermarkets.
solve problems that basically keep people more local, connected to their culture, connected to their states,
a few years ago,
indigenous and native to this area. So you can kind of get people to be like, hey, we can.
This is coming anyways. You can either use it to achieve those benefits and get out ahead of it, or
and the reaction everyone's
and then if you want to kind of prevent getting away from a reliance on agriculturalists, where
like I think
you
a lot of people are willing to
if you bar the consumption or
I think there's probably three high-level nudge categories.
Personal
push these
something like
technologies
that,
towards a more
if a policy would do that,
equitable
they basically make
status in
all those
society.
guys, and
One would be direct laws and regulations, minimum wage, or just requiring that people have to properly account for sort of back-end infrastructure costs for Lyft and Uber.
Just basically
there's more informal indirect
the areas where there's
support where they can offer subsidies for urban interior,
and then
fair wages.
I think you're then you're getting back to.
And there could also be
any community
on the demand side. There could be PR campaigns for people like, hey, you're using a company that's not properly paying people or is not leading towards a more equitable society. That's bad. You should fix that.
That is probably the best ringtone.
Those are probably the three.
I think
the more narrowly tailored
because right now they have a way
more
of
likely to
malaria there's
fail.
no benefit from it.
Because
there's going to be people who work against you. Well, they're not going to work directly against you. They're going to foster like a religious discontent with you to prevent quotation. Even if they don't like malaria, they like the fact that there's U.S. aid dollars coming.
Or the net manufacturer.
Yeah,
the system-wide
the
decision to raise the minimum wage.
Having malaria.
You need to make sure you bring them into the conversation so that they have another means. Well, that's kind of like we talked about this years ago, I think, about how BP actually did their assessment of sustainable energy back in the 90s before it was even a major thing to consider. Because I had always been saying, I was like, I don't care if the same big cats are in the energy industry. We just need safer energy policy. So go ahead and have your mobiles and your Exxons and your Sunocos and all that.
Cities have the right
BP,
comply or you're
be
fine.
behind solar panels
there are
and
legal
wind
fights
and all that. I don't mind, but whatever. And that would at least hopefully get them to buy into it, because then they can still make their money, but they're just the face of the new sustainable energy market. Turns out that there wasn't a price tag high enough for them to do that. But that's the idea, is to bring in the shoppers and say, we have another avenue for you to still make your living.
So there's one thing we're missing so far. Let's say
I don't know.
we are
Wait a minute, you gave 3 examples.
brilliant,
One was sort of a
well-funded,
PR
we've got the
campaign
strategic
about
go-to-market, and we've kind of
this is a
anticipated
good
first order
organization.
things that we
and
want to
their
have
their
right,
workers right.
and
This
second
is
order things that we're trying to
Yeah.
confuse that are
Yeah,
bad.
but people,
What we're missing
users,
with this,
non-users or
the
whatever
long tail
thing
of
will
opportunity.
say, I
Millions of
don't
people
use
might have
this,
access
I
to
don't need
this.
it.
I'm picturing laying
Only
on
when
this some
it's
type
a
of
system,
exercise,
geographic
with
wide,
some
system
fanfare,
wide,
some
everyone's
kind of social
affected.
media tie-in, such that yes, we
There's
solve
no
malaria,
silver
that's a
bullet,
big
there's no
thing.
one answer
Yes,
to
we
anything.
prevented
You're
this
using a
through
multitude
some
of
type
approaches.
whatever. We've got
If you want to have the
people
greatest
who are
likelihood
ready
of
to
pushing
take
these towards
advantage
a
of
more
the fact
just
that
world,
malaria is solved. These are big first
should
order
do all the
problems.
above.
But there's a million of these things out there. There's
So,
10 million of these out there. What else
You're
are we
arguing
solving?
the
Are we
first thing you have to
solving
do is
homeless
PR,
camps? Are we
is
solving-
establish
So basically
something,
make people
a
volunteer
legal
to brilliant
framework
ideas
to
by
change the
I'm a big
setting up
crowdsourcing.
systems.
Yeah, I mean, people do it anyway. That's why they're buying this, right?
Yeah.
They're not really volunteering.
Okay.
They're,
Yeah,
they're
it'd be
promoting
great to
successes that they
drastically
have.
increase the minimum
And
wage or
if
have something
you
absolute like
are
that.
incenting
I suspect that
some
there
type
are
of
many informal
national,
nudges.
international kind of
Like, I
award
think part of the
panel,
reason why it's
some
listed
legitimacy
other
to these kind of garage innovators.
rideshare companies are not
So
paying
if
as
you're
fair of a wage as
incenting all
my
these
peers
kind of
because
garage innovators,
drivers themselves
what
have to
you're
pay all the
doing is
infrastructure and back
holding
end
up
and
the
maintenance costs for the
positives
vehicles.
of all the good.
So there's things that are hidden there that aren't necessarily
as
addressed by
opposed
the
to the small good, as opposed to the big good that
And also
we're
all those nudges
strategically
help
planning.
But even as the world exists now, the people who are opposed to this,
political will
basically opposed to
doesn't
it
come from
because of that.
That's right.
It just dawned on me that there's probably another type of nudge, which is more within the engineer's control that affects this, which is to have them design into these things.
Once you show the long tail to be useful, that's
try to make sure that however those things are done, that they're paid for in a equitable way. It's not just offloading everything onto the
That's
user.
right. Absolutely. That's why I was trying to think, if this was to
It's just
happen,
the thing about
because if you keep it
like
at
when you talk about
$50,000,
engineering, like
then what we just described makes sense.
I wonder how these
Becomes
things
like
are even
$300,
designed and
$300.
they last scooters.
Then,
I
then
know
we
that
have to
the,
address that long tail.
the Chinese bikes that I think have largely pulled out.
So
like,
if
they're
the
like
second horizon is a matter of
That's
trying to
nothing.
think of that
Right.
policy
Because they were overused.
to
well, they're
keep it
it
going in the
belongs to
direction
no
we
one and
want.
therefore no one cares about it.
What's
Like,
the third
sit out in
horizon?
the
I know
rain,
the third
maybe
horizon
cars
we're
out
basically
in
shooting
the
for.
rain.
Yeah,
basically
around
in
here.
Sit on the
concrete. So I
rain,
think
people would like throw them
I think
in
the point of the
rivers
exercise
just to
for
be
me is to
cool.
think more
Right.
concrete.
Well, there are a
What
group
do you
of those.
want
I forget somebody
on that third horizon?
I want to say that they were
what's gonna
termed
be
X
your
because I can't remember the
tangible
name. So
second horizon thing?
I showed some photographs
That's the whole
of
idea,
the
right?
scooters
Is
abandoned and the bikes
futurism,
abandoned because I've been telling my
literally the
colleagues
next minute is
what's
also
the issue
future. So
here,
what are
what's
you gonna do
going on.
then? It's
Why?
life planning and that kind of thing.
Do people not
You're,
care?
as you go further
It's
out,
almost
your-
like disposable
your,
rubbish.
specificity
Before the
of
litter
information
campaign,
decreases,
do
but
not litter.
1 month, 6
You know,
months,
when I
1
was
year, 3
growing
years,
up,
5 years,
don't
10
be a
years,
tosser
20
in
years,
Australia.
50 years.
Don't be a tosser. You know,
Tosser.
a tosser, right?
So let's
And
put
so
it at
you had
50,000.
anytime there
Say
was
we're solving malaria,
the
whatever,
protagonist
through
being a
institutional
tosser,
collegiate partnerships.
the response was not
Second
very
order
favourable
is
from the
just a
crowd. So you'd
function
get
of
10
time.
people turning
Gets
around
to,
and like doing this
$1,000
there.
that weren't white people are buying
But they
this right
toss
for
and
their
they don't
kids.
care, and they're on.
And then
they're-
eventually,
so
you know,
it's almost public
or
infrastructure abandoned on
I'm
public
just saying,
on
the one
public infrastructure. It's
thing
strange.
that's highly
But it's
predictable
also,
here is the cost.
I've heard, I don't know if
And
it's
so
true, that
if
some
we
of, like,
looked at that from a cost
some of
curve,
these
we know
scooters in
early on
particular, there were a couple of companies that
$300
they
is
never
gonna
got
be
the approvals
$100,000.
from
You're gonna be
the
still on that
local
first horizon,
government.
you're still,
So they would just
You're still
say, well,
basically
the
in your
heck
current
with
world
that,
with
we
just
will
little
just
blips here
set
and
up
there.
So I'm not answering
and
your question, I'm
operate
just saying one
outside, so
consideration
they
that can help frame our
got their
discussion is how does
10
the
little
price
scooters
point
right
change?
here on the
Yeah,
street,
I mean,
and
you
they,
could
on the
throw a
sidewalk,
third
they have
axis
their
on the right
permission,
and
you
have it be
download
cost.
the app, you
Cost
find it.
goes down
But
as
this
time goes
town,
on.
the city, which never
And
gave
that's
permission,
why you
looked
end
at
up getting
those scooters as
a shift from the old world to the new
tossed
world.
trash
Yeah.
on
So then,
their
okay, what
streets and
is-
would pick them up for
And I
them
guess
and
is it a
throw them
policy
in their
change?
trash
That's our
barrel.
second rising
As,
kind of buffer
you know,
us
because
between
this is
what we
trash,
have now
obviously.
and what we expect.
So I don't know
in
if
the
the
future is
100 days
basically
all
regulation. That seems awfully
Well, that was
one side on a political
think I read
spectrum
it was
there.
But
DC
you know, if
where
it's
the bikes
50,000
were.
and there's say
Oh, really?
100
Yeah.
units
And that was
spread
100
across, you know,
Yeah, I don't remember
tier
exactly,
one
but it was
universities and then a couple
an
of
alarmingly low
biomedical
figure.
companies.
So the scooters
I mean,
do get trashed,
that's a base
and
against
especially
which you
after
can
Saturday night, and because the kids and I
regulate
live
policy
downtown,
against.
Yeah.
we see the
At that
reclaiming
$50 price
scooters
point,
every
you were
night.
starting to
And
bake in your
if I said to
window,
you,
if
just
you
say
can
there
look
are
it
a
up,
few scooters
to write
here,
policy.
and there are a few
You've
here,
got enough good
and
news and enough bad news to
the driver is
once it gets
driving,
out, the cat's out of the bag.
realizes that the
You could also
scooters are there,
try to
will
limit
turn
it
right
because
onto the busiest road of
could make
downtown
it so that it
Tempe,
requires
decide to go this way, and then realize, oops, I could go this way a few more extra meters. Meanwhile, traffic's backed up because this ute is going like this. He then goes to the opposite side of the road.
This is just a scooter or is it?
So he's in a
What
ute,
about
and he's regathering all the scooters back because they put them where they're going to be. In an SUV, forgive me, Aussie term, utes is an Aussie term. Not toss-up, but ute. So he's basically, and they're usually between 40 and 50 years of age. They're not students, most of them
just like,
they're
there's
not.
no way I
They're
can afford that.
pretty big guys that can lift
By the way,
about
maybe
10 of
just
these
miss your
things
other
and
ideas.
just throw them on. But
Okay.
they will repair them usually on Saturday nights, Saturday mornings.
Yeah,
And
that's not my role.
they're repairing a bot, but they'll do this business in the middle of the road without a care in the world over what's going on with the traffic. Like they own the road. So I'll stop right in the middle of the road.
That's how I always assume things.
We'll drive around and and if I see another, oh, there's one, I'll do the same. There is no structure.
There's really a lot of competition too to charge them because you can make good money, but it's
That's
like
right.
where I read it, it's probably like Wired something what it's like.
Oh, you mean so the guy that's picking it up
is earning commission by zapping each one, I think.
Because
Yeah.
we think it's
There's also,
theoretically possible. Even,
you know, how your
what I'm saying is
unintended
that
consequences of your
we then
reward structure.
fail fast strategy? You
That's
make
the
this
thing,
investment.
earn more money.
we are gonna fail. I'm assuming that
Finding
there's lots of
a
failures.
scooter that
So you
hasn't
sort
been used for a
out
while,
the
or a
bad,
scooter
one of the
that's
bad
battery is
stuff that
completely
way.
dead.
That
So people will then take the
then know
scooters and store them at their
unintended
home.
consequences.
And then
wait until they totally
Yeah, wait until they hit the
Same
maximum.
in my apartment.
I think at $50
charge,
price point,
whatever.
you can't control
Now I
that.
know why they did it.
I don't think that there's enough
That's
incentives.
why.
I love how you might be
I mean, and some people will just take them because
You're like, well, if we use a marketing strategy of
So
product
there's
promotion
a
in place, and
No. But I mean,
certainly
this is what I do. I mean,
Yeah.
I did a go-to-market
into
for
this
a
ownership
DARPA-funded phase 3
So
successful
what's the business
mesh
innovation
network
here?
that was really
What are we going to
game-changing,
do?
and we spent a lot of time on it.
I like
all this.
I like the
I mean,
idea
this
of
is my
it's
day
cool.
job.
It's cool.
getting rid of us, incentivizing
I
people
unfortunately
to
have
get
to
rid
get
of
to
their
mine. I
second
have to
car,
go
which
to
will
some
knock
students.
out
It's
knock
not
out
really unfortunate. I
$10,000
enjoy it. I don't know why I said
from
that.
paying you spend maintenance.
This was great. So thank you so much, Amy.
I have a friend who has
and
a
Bob, thanks for,
house here in
speaking with
DC.
me. Thanks for having me.
I'm the only one
And
who
it
knows
was
about
good to meet you.
Parking spaces behind her house, and she rents
are
out
you
to
local?
Zipcar. And she
Leesburg.
says it's great.
My cousin
And
loves
she
it.
car is a
Country
big
mouse.
corporation. They
Yes.
send her a check every
I mean, I'm
month.
local.
They
Bob,
plan-
you said you were
You know,
too.
she does nothing
Yeah.
other
And
than
Not much.
I'm gonna
doesn't have two
be at your
cars.
talk
Yeah.
tomorrow morning
She
too.
rented her parking spaces
But
to
yeah, this is great. And
Like Airbnb, but
Yeah,
do like
but-
a thread or people that
yes.
So
spoke
yeah,
and
What if we
stuff,
rented
and
our
we can
cars?
continue to trade ideas or whatever.
other people working on
Yeah.
Well, they have Berkshire as well.
Yes, they have.
Yeah,
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would.
40 to 70 dollars.
All right.
Owning
Oh,
a
no.
car-
Thanks again.
Owning a car.
No, if this guy owns a car, he rents it
I
out.
would- I would-
Oh,
I
that
would-
sort of.
I'd be afraid
Yeah.
to put my car into
And if
that.
there is anything
Oh,
moving
yeah.
on
In terms
this,
of,
spelling
And I
out
think-
last
Oh, it won't be.
name
Wait
is-
a minute, what? So you own a car, you would,
no, I own a car,
okay.
which I, in literally
Right.
5 years,
Thank
I
you,
put
thank
on
you, Andrew.
fewer than 15,000 miles.
This one,
Okay, so it's
But-
1,000 a year.
Most people put like 7,500, 10,000 miles a
Yeah.
year.
Because
But
that
I
is
wouldn't
really
dare put it on a car share thing
a
because it would be.
societal system,
Yeah.
a large ecosystem as opposed to.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It starts as a product.
But there are
So
people
if
who are
we end
working
up-
on
but
trying
to
to
work with
create,
what we have,
like,
I think one
literally
question that I have
carpools,
is,
you know, to like
rising
big
one
urban
is a
areas where, you know, you
$100,000
pick up Joe, who in theory you never knew but lived
Yeah.
2 blocks down the
Horizon
street.
3 is the 50
to the same
the $500 one.
Yeah.
What is it that disappears?
Oh, I saw, I think it was like Ford rolled
Is
out
it just the
similar.
price, or are there other?
Not necessarily a car
here
share,
there were
like,
some things that disappeared.
Rent a car.
Yes.
It's sort of weird because I'm like, well, how's this different from a lease?
Uh-huh.
It was $400 a month. Way more.
Like some of this, some of
400
this
a month.
esoteric stuff.
That's
only
because
happens-
they've all
well,
realized
it
that
only
car
happens at
maintenance for the
scale.
second car
Yeah,
is between 200 and 400. So on the lower limit, we looked at Chandler, for example, which is about 25 minutes out of downtown Tempe
Mhm.
and has no transit. Living there, 3,700
said,
to 9,600 in
most are
annual
more
spend for the
societal,
second car
does that mean they
per
did a
household.
better job than ours?
Right.
So
Uh,
300
No,
a
no,
month,
no,
which
no,
is
no.
Lyft's sort of subscription model, 400 a month for Ford.
Just got
They've
higher
worked
grade,
out
right?
people don't want to drive, have the anxiety, so So bless you, Kim. So they are hitting that price point. So if you
Yes,
can swap
I think so. I mean, the
what you're
question
doing,
is there, so we started in a
and not have to drive. Look at me, I'm an
really
international.
kind
I've
of
still bought a
societal
car in
that we
Arizona.
necessarily want.
It's killing me, but it's a good experiment for the time being. But I'm limited. I can't go to Tucson. I can't go to the Grand Canyon. I can't take the kids camping. Blah blah, which is not like me, right?
I thought we thought this would be our
how do you fix that? Like, how do you transition that?
Right?
Can you guys
maybe it is a new model, subscription model. I don't know. What are we going to say?
None of us have a crystal ball.
No, I mean, I think.
Can't you see a $500 CRISPR at some point in the future?
So wait a minute, let's go back to you. So you live in Arizona, and you live in a city, but you have chosen not to buy a car.
Yes.
But you wish you had a car on the weekends, so you could go to the Grand Canyon.
I wish I have a car when the children were playing sport even.
Health technology.
It's not cheap.
But it's also not close.
If
But
you get
it's not
years
because
of
of the nature of the technology, it's because of the actual social systems that we
Is Get Around in Arizona?
I don't know.
I think that's the service he was talking about. So you rent someone else's car, but
That's
they.
right.
I don't know which way.
It is in Arizona.
Part of the service is that someone will drop the car off close to
cost disruption in a market.
Everyone I've spoken to, the hubs, they've got
non-regulated market.
So I'm not sure. There may well be someone willing to come and drop the car off.
There's another one.
Enterprise.
So imagine we're talking about accessibility or knowledge of these services being available. Perhaps that is the stumbling block.
Well, they used to be, not anymore, rent-a-cars called Rent-a-Wreck, which specialized in rent-a-cars which were like 5 to 10 years old.
Yeah.
And they were a lot less expensive than other ones. And when I was working in Florida, we used to get them.
Interesting.
That I would have to rent my car under the rent-a-wreck philosophy.
Technology where
So what is your price point that you would want to have this car for the weekend to go to the Grand Canyon?
I don't know. At the moment,
So somebody said it was $100 for the weekend. Would that?
It's a bit expensive. I think I've done 4 trips on a Saturday during carving the pumpkins for Halloween.
Okay.
And I've paid $45.
Are you in a place where you can
Each day
share
for all
with us
4
what you've done?
Which obviously this is
Are you in a place where you can share with us what you've done?
So
Yeah, but we don't.
Ours didn't go exactly, you know,
I'm not going to
so
say.
this could be quite away.
Sure, Amy.
and cultural.
Yeah.
So you paid $45 for 4 trips at 45.
One day, $4.
And the total was $45.
Which is not a lot.
U.S. and
comparatively when I think about what I've spent.
all of the discussion in
Okay.
Asia is over here and here.
So that's your price
Space
for
where we
$50.
can sort of share
A
with
day?
them what we
A
did.
day, because
There's
I also
some
take the
dollars.
kids to activities during the week, and the kids also have enrollments. And
Deposit
One
some
of you
of
has
the.
to do that, 'cause I was in the
CGP.
bathroom.
So
I pointed first.
No, the price went, so I
That's the
I do as well. To go teach.
would have been quicker than waiting. If you know these services, like the ride sharing services, you know they exist, if you know they're just a button away, if you know there's other opportunity exists, and it's easy to actually get there. So I think we could have the kind of
I mean,
to understand what you're signing,
there's not a lot of
then you
pressure
do
to-
it.
No.
But the hesitation.
Everyone gets a star for participation, right?
I don't know how to even get
Do you
a ride
need
share.
this
I know
microphone, or
there's
can we
a
just
chance,
talk?
but they don't have the.
You know,
But you got these, right?
Ride shares,
You two guys have the.
well, there are a bunch of problems.
Oh, you don't need a mic, but
First of
these
all,
two
they require a
groups.
smartphone,
Okay.
which is,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
they almost always, and they require a credit card, like Uber requires.
It's gonna be
a
pretty,
credit
well, it's gonna be clear.
Just check with the weather.
So we just have a few minutes, like 10 minutes left. I think that both groups just had a discussion, but maybe we can, replay to each other some of the things that were salient about that discussion, and then, I have just a couple of things to say. Move on with the day.
I think the first this time. We went first last time.
Who's gonna go first, guys? Zach, tell us.
I can do it.
Okay, go ahead.
So, I don't think we need to display this, but just to remind, we were talking about alternative transportation technologies, and one observation is that many new technologies get disproportionately used by those who have higher wealth. So many of the people who are currently using Uber or other things are not the same people who are working as dishwashers in the back of a restaurant, who are working third shift and other things. And so the idea of one sort of third generation big picture wave goal towards these technologies is to steer them in a way such that their use in society will be part of a more sort of equitable and just system, that it's not making life more convenient for those who already have wealth, and that it helps everyone have a higher quality of life in general. And so we were discussing different ways in which to push towards such a goal. There could be things that would influence both the demand and as well as the supply and how these things are produced. Ways to influence the supply of how these alternative transportation technologies will be produced. You could have actual legal requirements that those who are supplying these things, who are producing the technologies, that they have to say meet certain minimum wage laws, and you can increase the minimum wage significantly for everything in a particular city or town or state. And therefore these, the production of these things would be done in a more equitable way. There's also been situations where those who are paying for those who use Uber and Lyft, there's claims that the infrastructure costs of maintaining a driver's car, that those are not necessarily accounted in the wages that they make. So there could be a role for sort of public subsidy of companies that are making sure that they pay for infrastructure costs that go beyond just directly paying for an individual's wages. Beyond just, and there's actually a third way in the supply that you actually have engineers that when they're thinking about designing and building these technologies that they take into concern, how are they going to be maintained and repaired? How can you make sure that the cost and the work and labor to do those sorts of things can be done in a more equitable manner? In terms of the supply, in terms of who's using these things, there could be some sort of public subsidy that tries to gear people towards using alternative transportation companies that are doing things in a more equitable fashion. There could be a broader PR campaign that like, hey, you're using this, or do you realize that that particular company isn't paying good wages or something like that. There's no one answer in how to sort of nudge a technological system towards a more, towards being in a sort of more equitable state of use in society, but probably some mixture or combination of all these things together is important. Another third wave change that we were talking about is how could this enable people to really transition away from the culture of always having to own your car, and how could one of us have a car that is not, one of us does not have a car and lives in an urban area, and how would they get out into the city? How would they be able to go and do things? What's the price point for that? And how do you potentially transition away from something that's very carbon intensive and maybe bad for the environment, but how do you transition away to do that? What's the price point that could enable these sorts of transitions to occur? So those are just some of the topics we talked about. Did I miss anything?
Sounds really productive, actually. Sounds like we have a space. Yes, we have our, yeah, we could probably just talk with us, or should we all just stand around here?
Make up the microphone.
How's the seal of that?
So I'll do it in reverse of how we kind of went through the conversation, because we were kind of thinking about ground truths, and I think where we ended is where we should start, which is the idea of a low-cost CRISPR is probably going to originate someplace out of Asia. And if you take that because of cultural constraints, ethical, cultural investment, institutional restrictions in the US, that in effect, and I think we can get to this conclusion, is our response to the third wave, which is we retain our cultural inhibitions against these kinds of technologies. We de-risk the potential downsides by not changing those mores, and that's a US response to third wave kind of things. If you play that story out, by the way, we didn't talk about this, but while China has the capital and the people and the institutional focus on this and the ability to influence this, I suspect it'll be a satellite of hacker mentality, people outside the control of state-dominated, maybe some Vietnam, Malaysia, whatever, where there's real innovation that really disrupts the curve. But if we think about the cost structures, which are, in my experience, cost structures are predictable, but I'm not medical. And we were talking about how medical cost structures go up over time and tech goes dramatically down. But if you think of this somehow meeting that hacker culture and outside of the institutional constraints of the US, hitting some type of declining cost structure, it doesn't get to 500 magically. It goes to a $100,000 phase, $1,000 phase, and $500 phase. At that $100,000 phase, if the US was to adopt it, let's say it originated someplace else, that's the place against which to regulate it, I believe. That we were talking about that. there's enough of an institutional focus that there's some traction, but it's small enough that you can kind of control it, maybe blockchain or whatever, in terms of all the things that come out of it, policies and controls. But by the time it gets to 500, it's too late. If you're again looking at US later adoption rates. That's basically what we talked about. And then I was starting the conversation with, if I was to counsel somebody on launching a $500 US or Western world-based CRISPR, desktop CRISPR, what I would say is before you launch, bake in your first and second order wins. Have beta users in hand before you launch that have notable case study wins that you can point to as success stories. Have communications partners under embargo to promote that as you launch. Have institutional downstream, let's say we cure, one of our goals is curing malaria. Have NGO third parties partnering with you to announce partnerships before you launch, such that they're able to redeploy capital from curing malaria to investing in education. So you have this institutional built-in momentum. The dominoes start to fall when you launch. The bad things will happen. You have built in some specific responses to known bad things that are likely to happen to help you from a PR perspective, and hopefully the momentum of your plan allows you to adapt to whatever happens. But I think the strength of this was where we ended, which is our responses probably wouldn't happen here. Did I miss anything, guys? Does that address the exercise?
Yeah. Well, that's more coherent, but yeah.
I just start with what you said.
Well, I mean, it's a very quick and dirty sort of, you could spend a long time on these sort of being a lot faster, a lot more deliberate than here's this idea that some people have and here's the shape of how to do it. I mean, just very minor comments. I just as a listener, think this is great. Thought it was very interesting in both the way that, so when I go other places in Washington, sort of AI is sort of dropped in as like magic dust, like we'll just get some AI. And it is interesting the way that regulation sort of played that a little bit in our conversation. I mean, I just noted that we sort of drop in regulation, which didn't do that much, but if we had it, that we could, well, let's just get some regulation around it. So that was just an interesting thing. And then I thought I would ask, just as a closing, if you wanted to reflect at all on the exercise itself. It was just after listening to this morning, for me, these are so simple. You, I'm sure, have ones in your back pocket that are similar, but just ways of not having to stop at we don't know, but what could we? So that was my goal. If you have any other comments for each other or for the exercise, that's terrific. And
this is what I do for a living, but at the same time, I don't believe a word of what I or any other expert puts out on take on paper. And I don't know how to respond to that other than I do this exercise regularly with massive billions of dollars of capital, and we're frequently wrong. And so my general response to people is lean startup mentality, spend as little capital as possible, learn, adapt, fail quickly, minimally viable product. And I do that from Fortune Global 10 company down to guys who I run into and ask me ideas. But it's the argument is that battle plan is the first victim of any battle, but there's no failure. You shouldn't have that shouldn't be an excuse to have failure to plan. So I don't know if I don't mean to be a downer on this. I think it's an important exercise. It's what I get paid to do, but I never believe what I write down.
Well, let me distinguish then between my goal one to say, well, all those spaces where we're saying we don't know, it's an opportunity to think about potentialities, possibilities, unintended consequences, so that when those are a little more baked, you can say, wow, maybe we should be, like you said, playing. But this wasn't intended, even though it may have the same shape, to be sort of like a client's kind of battle plan for how do we get to here. It's what might happen that we didn't think about. Oh, then what might happen?
And it's good for us
just a different use of that.
And this is good to think about what values do we hold, what you want to see, and then where should we focus our attention. It's not necessarily about prediction, but it's more about just guiding us towards what we already believe in and to help us do the things that we should already be caring about but I know I already realize.
What do we want to manifest in the world?
I like that, Amy. When our team put up community, and then we thought about people actually talking to one another, it was very nice. It was a nice moment, and I thought, well, yes, that's a positive outcome. You mentioned community, I think, Zach. But also, it reminded me of papers I've reviewed for the journal that's on the table there. Please take as many copies before you go this afternoon. And give them out to students, give them out to whomever you want, you've got them. But the World Build program at the University of Southern California was created by Alex McDowell, who created Minority Report. And I mentioned Minority Report this morning, and he and two of his colleagues submitted a paper. And World Build is actually what do you want the world to be? And the city they chose was Makoko in 2036. And they created an environment that looked at it from the ecological perspective, economic, population, health, culture, music, and everything you can imagine. And it's just basically this global picture. And it's a globe with all these elements in there. And bloggers would talk about what they thought Makoko 2036 would look like. Some people were dystopian, other people were utopian. But the whole point was, if we want to build a dystopia, it's very, and Alex and his team think dystopia is very easy. Utopia is very hard. And it comes back to that word that we see in Polar Express. You know, at the end of the movie, you know, the little kid gets his ticket and he looks down at the ticket and he says, I believe. Yeah. Right? And one of the reasons I think sometimes in our corporations, wherever we used to work in industry or have worked or still work, things don't happen, like community building doesn't happen because of this or that. Actually, we don't believe it can happen. And I think if we had enough backing in ourselves, confidence, and it's not just confidence, it's belief, not self-belief, but belief in our community. It's what McDowell talks about in the World Build program. Is it if we all, and you're never going to have a utopia, that's the opposite, right? You're not going to have that, but if you strive for community, but we don't get community and we get something that resembles community, or a better close-knit community, or a community that talks to each other when they see each other and it doesn't just bump elbows while they're trying to get through the mall. I think that belief, because I know what stopped me in industry. I was young, I had a huge role, I had not billions, but I had $500 million over 10 years as a budget with the 3G rollouts that I was doing. And like you, I had some guy, CFO, tell me at a meeting, no, it's not going to be 25 years payback, it's going to be 12 and a half years payback. Half of what I had estimated. But I knew he was wrong. But I go, okay, I'll put it to 12 and a half years. And that shifts the capital expenditure to be astronomical and not possible for them to purchase. But you still do it because that's what they want. Or you double the average revenue per user because that'll make everything balanced, right? And you just make it 12 and a half years. And that's actually exactly how it works. Yeah. But if I had belief, I would have looked at him and gone, you know what? It's going to be 25 years. And if you want anything else, then you're kidding your shareholders. That's it, right? And then be told off big time by the CEO, the country manager, wireless manager, and go, well, I told the truth. And that's what the spreadsheet says, you know, and I don't, but it's the belief. And I actually think that's the difference. What's happened to us, well, we all go to work, we all believe in our work, that's why we go to work every day, you know, but to drive things through that are big, you have to have belief. And I think when you mentioned the word, I thought that's the message of today.
Or small. I mean, this change begins with small things.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be billions of dollars.
Yes.
The woman starting up an Etsy store, the kid who goes and picks up a book and says, I'm going to be a whatever. Just that little bit of belief is.
Thank you so much, Amy. I know you have to run to class.
I'm going to go teach.
Yeah,
But I'll take magazines. So
thank you, please. And we've got 2 more talks. We're going to thank Amy. Yes, I know, that's right. We've got Ethan and then Mahmoud. So we can start. We've got Lee Woodkin who's thank you so much. See you again.
We'll have the short and long articles. You're facing DC, right? For lunch.
For sure. Same to you. I'm sorry, made you sit through mine and I'm going again.
No. Please. The local email. I just.
It's the morning. We don't take you all day.
And also hosting for.
Sorry, I said that's talk, but I've never been asked to talk.
Well,
Plan health.
Is sticking your arm?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm not saying you don't know.
I'm a little bit passionate about it. Thank you for inviting me, because obviously I care about this stuff. There's not a lot of forums to like make these kind of claims in the room. So.
Okay, should I start? Okay, look. First, thank you for coming. I'll pretend that there's 300 or 400 people out there to inspire me. But don't feel too bad, Katina, because I know I'll be giving this presentation someplace else in the near future. But I'm one of these people that still reads newspapers. And I still read both the New York Times and the Financial Times. And this is why you should read the New York Times, which is on the front page are photos of Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg with
this is yesterday's?
This is today's. And it says, delay, deny, deflect, how Facebook leaders leaned out in a crisis, which I feel very good because the timing is perfect, Katina, but we doing transnational financial crime, corruption type thing. Meaning didn't affect the counting of the election outcome, but they totally did not deal with the social media aspect of it. So the road talk of my presentation is first to discuss very briefly why the Russians were doing what they were doing, then their operational plans, then there's a professor at University of Pennsylvania who was also very frustrated by that question, but she had studied prior presidential elections, and then she did her analysis, and then a little bit on alternatives and takeaways, and then I have a few slides of appendices, which I won't discuss. I have a much longer presentation of like 35 slides, which could be shared through Katina. But the important background is coming from like a Russian military sort of national security standpoint, they view conflict as being a full spectrum of competition, including things like influence campaigns, economic campaigns, cyber, whereas the US tends to see things more black and white. There's war and peace and then competition in between. We are in a constant state of conflict with Russia, but we quite frankly don't understand that. At least most people don't understand that. Specialists do, but when military people are speaking to political people and speaking to lawyers who specialize in the law of armed conflict, they all cross-speak, which is a big problem. The other thing also to keep in mind, everything that Russia did in terms of our elections, and I use the plural elections because it wasn't just the presidential election, the consequences of what Russia did affected the Senate, the House, and ultimately the Supreme Court, so that the consequences are far-reaching. But what they were doing in 2016 was very similar to what they experimented on with respect to Ukraine and subsequently with respect to Brexit. One of the reasons that Brexit turned out the way it did is probably that the Russians did the same thing there in terms of influencing social media. Unfortunately, the Brits are a little bit less willing to discuss this because the Prime Minister, it will undermine her, even though she was against Brexit when she was up for election. Wrong slide. Context, a little bit of memory. I always had this slide because usually about a third of my audience are not US citizens. And the only reason it's important to remember is the Democrats were fairly complacent going into the final thing. Yes, Hillary Clinton was the worst presidential candidate the Democrats had in recent years, probably since George McGovern, but it was very simple. The only thing she had to do was basically win everything that Obama won the second time around, but lose Florida, or lose Michigan or Pennsylvania. Not lose all four. But she did. She managed to lose all four, and she lost because of 50,000 votes. Now, in terms of sort of background, we have to think of who constitutes the electorate in the United States. The electorate is very influenced by the fact that they do not watch television the way my generation watched television. We grew up watching either Walter Cronkite, Harry Reasoner, Huntley Brinkley. Basically, three choices, and there was the least common denominator of the informed population, say 60% of the people. Another thing which is important, and people can imagine this, the labor force in the United States was 40% unionized. That meant being members of the unions, they were basically told who was best for them. And if you assume that there was a lower percentage of women participating in the workforce and less likely to be influenced in terms of their own political opinions, it meant that 40% males add 15%, 20% in terms of people whose opinions are being influenced by the union movement, which is one of the reasons the Democrats had more or less the upper hand in terms of communications about political matters than compared to the Republicans. But also, the whole news cycle changed with CNN, the 24/7 news cycle, the idea which Trump sort of masterminded, which is to dominate the 24/7 news cycle. Any attention was better than no attention. And also the assumption that even bad news, if you're the lead story, is better than no news. On this topic, these are the principal books discussing Trump, the lead up to the election. The ones on the outside are all recent, and mind you, there'll be another book next month and another book the following month, because this is a work in progress. And until the House Intelligence Committee and the House Judiciary Committee are done with their investigation, we really will not know anything about this. But I was in correspondence with Professor Jameson, and this is really, really my key takeaway, that with the focus on what the Russians did in the election of 2016, there's been very little attention in terms of what the Trump campaign itself did in terms of social media, as well as what Perscale's operations in connection with Cambridge Analytica did, because they were doing very, very similar things. But a lot of the discussion sort of assumes that it was just the Russians that were really doing this. But what they were really doing was magnifying what the Trump campaign was already doing. They may have been more willing to take risks and sort of go to the edge of what was socially acceptable than Trump was. But it was the same thing, which explains why it was effective. But in terms of motivations of Putin, one, it's essential to understand that the United States has a history of interfering in Russian political activity, that Boris Yeltsin's election or re-election as president in 1996 was in large part because we bankrolled him. And we supplied political advisors to his campaign, et cetera. He was in single digits, and then he ultimately won, and there's bags of money going around. And then also when Putin was initially president, there was a big concern about the so-called color revolutions. He was looking at what was going on in Ukraine, looking at what's going on in North Africa, and he was terrified. And Russia has this sort of siege mentality, even though the reason why they have hostile neighbors is that their neighbors are concerned about what they do to them. There was a legitimate concern about the color revolutions because Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was from Putin's standpoint, encouraging people to go to the streets, so that from his standpoint, what goes around comes around, or what comes around goes around. And lastly, with respect to Obama, people are saying, well, if all this was taking place, why didn't Obama do something? And Trump himself asked the same question. Well, the reason was that Hillary Clinton in all the polls was ahead 4%, 6%, 7%. And Obama basically felt that if he intervened strongly, it would undermine Hillary Clinton's legitimacy. Well, he ended up undermining her election. The troll operation. IRA is, prior to this last go around, to me, is always the Irish Republican Army. But the troll factory, it's kind of funny because PBS NewsHour interviewed people that were working there, a couple of months before the election. They were interviewing people to say, what are you doing in this building? And these guys would be explaining what they were doing. I was sort of thinking, I think their contracts will not be renewed. But this is not a small operation. And there's an effort to sort of downplay what it is. They have 4 sort of branches. They had a data analysis branch, they had a graphics branch, they had technology, and a search engine optimization branch. And the thing about Russians and computers is they're good at this stuff. Anything that's done indoors, Russians do well. Music, Russians do well. Ballet, Russians do well. Ice hockey, Russians do well. Basketball, Russians do well. And computers, Russians do well. Another thing about understanding the world, Americans are not good with foreign languages. We sort of assume that the rest of the world is like us, so that if people are putting up ads and doing various things, trying to manipulate our social media, that a foreigner can't do that, other than like an Aussie or a Brit or a Canadian. Well, the fact is, Russians who study languages speak or write in English. I studied at Leningrad State University back in 1981, and the teachers that I had were astounded how terrible the American students were, because when they study English, they have English phonetics, English translation, English grammar, like 5, that's all they have. They don't have electives in different fields, so that their level of expertise in their area is much higher than ours. But basically what was going on with the troll operation, the first thing was basically widespread messaging. The idea being they want to raise the issues to the public's awareness that they should care about. Next thing had to do with getting their messages aligned with that of the Trump campaign. The idea of making race, crime, policing, immigration, guns in the face of Facebook users, friends, Twitter feeds, this type of thing. The next thing had to do with mobilizing veterans, whites, Christians, evangelicals, at the same time angering supporters of Sanders and African Americans, try to discourage the fact that they would turn out at the polls. And then the idea of persuasive appeals. I have a lot of graphics in the other presentation which are intended to offend, which they do. But the idea at the very end, you have narrowed down through your various mechanisms for screening the 100,000 people that you really want to target. And the idea that you have very well targeted content, you know who they are, you're guessing who they are by what county they live in the various states. The key thing in the election, and with all the hacking and everything, with the social media aspects, it's really all secondary to the stealing of the media. That was, stealing of the emails, because that was what really made everything. That WikiLeaks, which is connected to the Russian government in various ways, which we will not know for a while, were basically releasing various emails at different times. And of course, the first wave of emails came shortly after the Access Hollywood tapes came out. And so basically, what seemed to be the beginning of the end of Donald Trump, when that came out, everyone's saying, it's over for him. The whole narrative switched. The focus on Trump's taxes sort of disappeared. And suddenly, there were it was Hillary Clinton's being targeted with bad stories. And it was just going more and more and more. Then there was an issue, a leaked document, which was actually not a leaked document, it was a fraudulent document, which was something that suggested that the FBI investigation would be contained. And that was released by Guccifer 2.0 and DCI links, which is probably somehow connected to WikiLeaks. And it created a problem because Comey thought it was real. So that Comey's decision to continue the investigation was based largely on a fraudulent document, a fake document, and then when the Attorney General met on the tarmac with former President Clinton, he saw that as further evidence of the public's possible perception that the whole thing is fixed, his investigation, and he didn't want that to happen because he thought that it would reflect badly on him, it would reflect badly on Hillary Clinton. And what's interesting, once again, if you look at the press and the other presentation, I have all these different headlines. When this story ran, FBI sees no clear link to Russia. This is like just before the election. That was a really terrible headline, because what that headline really meant was, as of this point, they hadn't found it, but they had not ended the investigation. The investigation was an ongoing effort, and that was in paragraph 4. And the rest of the story discussed all the different leads that they were pursuing. This was just that up to this time, the FBI wasn't willing to sign off on a document saying that there were links. And this just shares some data in terms of the consequences. IRA generated 3,500 ads, which reached 29 million people, mostly directly from Facebook. There were another 97 million people, which reached 126, which resulted in 126 million views. The ads were spread when people clicked on like or followed on Russian-created websites. Twitter claimed that actually there's a million there, 1.4 million people interacted with Russian trolls, and eventually Twitter took down 200,000 Russian trolls and millions of Instagram things, whatever, various data. Now, Jameson, is probably the best summary of what her research was about, but the idea being that the Russian trolls were, with the passage of time, able to target effectively the key states, which resulted in Clinton's victory, basically Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And the other thing being that it was really IRA itself, which was able to do that with the passage of time, the targeting stuff, that they really didn't need to have the help from either the Trump campaign or Cambridge Analytica. Now, that fact may mean that it took place, or it may not mean it took place. We, once again, don't know that. And this is just, it's not worth going in, but it's basically a 5-part step-by-step thing of her model in terms of social media influencing campaigns. I think I sort of went over these things before. One thing which is important to emphasize, which is this. People remember negativity. Negative things motivate voters. Positive doesn't. And so that the idea that you're voting against someone as opposed to voting for someone works a lot more, especially with someone like Hillary Clinton. Brad Perscale got paid $96 million by the Trump campaign during the campaign. And that is a question which is not yet been answered, which is what does his organization do in the 2016 campaign to earn so much money? And I would hope that Mr. Mueller is looking into this among other things. But if the Russian effort was what tipped the election, was he knowingly allowing his computer systems to be hacked so that they were able to communicate? Was he communicating directly? Now, he is going to be the campaign manager for Trump's 2020 campaign. What does that do? It allows him to get paid on an ongoing basis for his services. So basically, he's on retainer because the Trump campaign began the day after Trump was inaugurated. So that his silence is very likely being bought with the passage of every single day. I don't know the extent to which that is being examined. Another thing which is really interesting, and he's kind of flippant about this because he went on all the talk shows after the election explaining what his role was. He actually went to Facebook and he said, look, I'm looking at the instructions online because there's not a Facebook user manual. I mean, there's all these different things you can look at. And Facebook, when they were contacted by him, he said, look, I want to place a bunch of ads and do a bunch of different things. And I'd like to meet with your people. Well, Facebook sent the people to Texas to work with him. And so he was able to make the media campaign by Donald Trump more useful. Was that information passed on to IRA in St. Petersburg? It would seem that given what was at stake and given sort of the nature of the Trump people and everything else in terms of the extent of Russian context in the books, you could see like all these different overlaps. And you look at, I mean, there's scores of people who had contacts with Russians in the year before the election. But here's a graphic which shows some of them in terms of Cambridge Analytica. But actually, I'm trying to think of this. But at the end, Professor Jameson makes some proposals in terms of what should be done in the future. And I kind of think of these as being fairly lame. The first idea being trying to have some way that the platforms will block false ads and things like that. Another, having campaign disclosures like this ad was paid for by X. Then having required supplemental information about who's placing the ads. Then outright prohibition on foreigners buying ads by having IRS verification. And prohibiting pandering to people's baser instincts in these types of ads. The problem is right now is that American citizens and American companies could do this themselves. They don't need the Russians to do this, and the Russians could go through shills and shams or simply organizations which they are aligned to in terms of values and goals, so that there's no need for them to do this anymore. And so all these things will have also First Amendment issue coming up. And there's also a thing called 501c4, which is a nonprofit organization that can make contributions to campaigns. The National Rifle Association, gave a tremendous amount of money to the Trump campaign. They have ties to the Russians. You probably followed that story. But the more one reads, the more astonishing it is, quite frankly. And it's hard to imagine anyone to have invented a plot line similar to that which one discovers as one digs. Anyway, that's sort of all I have here. As I said, I have different things about Hillary Clinton's campaign and whatnot, but I could share the longer presentation through Katina. But am I within the time?
Yes, you are.
I could have covered the other 50 slide things in 22 minutes. But anyway.
I'd like to thank you. Before we let you go, I know there's going to be questions. This topic is really controversial.
Excuse me, could you switch it to the other presentation? Because there may be things I want to refer to in the other. How big is big version? Okay. Questions? Comments? Expression of views?
So I have a question.
Okay.
So, after and it's the question about use of data analytics to influence an outcome. Okay. After Obama's second election, Sacha Baron wrote this book called Victory Lab, and which was celebrated like the marvel that they did by using data analytics to find out those fence-sitting voters and creating the most efficient door knocks through the door-to-door canvassing process. So data analytics used for an outcome was celebrated. And here Cambridge Analytica, again, used data analytics to manipulate, but but the use of data analytics in election itself is that a debatable question, should or should not be used, when we like the outcome versus when we don't like the outcome?
Well, I think the difference is with the Obama thing, it was not done with an element of deceit. It was sort of like trying to identify their voters and not either in an effort to mislead other voters and not playing on sort of emotions to generate your base in opposition to another segment of American society. I think is probably the best answer. I mean, these are some of these are from the Russian feeds. You could see them. That's right. I mean, these are not the types of things that you would see as a mirror opposite of what the Obama campaign would have.
What I'm saying is that the means, the goals were different, the intended use and purpose was different, but the same data analytics, getting people's behavior, but also figuring out how you can do it, because they showed how it could be done. Because the Romney also had an operation, and his computer was smoking the election day. They just could not figure out how Obama generated all these voters in Florida, because no model showed that there were these voters out there. And that encourages the use of data analytics in this kind of thing. And it can be just like we were debating about bad actors and good actors. It can be, and here we see an example where you have a state with bad intentions and can really weaponize the same tool that can be a powerful tool for democracy in a different sense.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two elements to that, which are, one, the issue of campaign contribution rules, which is that so long as the money is identified as campaign contribution, you're okay. When it's not, it's problematic. And it also has to do with foreign money in a campaign. And there's a prohibition on that. I mean, the thing is, what the Russians, as I said, what the Russians did could be done, again, a different way. I mean, their operation in St. Petersburg is estimated to be at $100 million. But there are enough people who, if there were good relations between Russia and the United States and, say, the oil and gas sector, would be willing to form 501c4 corps to be against a hostile candidate, because their economic interest as a company and for their shareholders is such that they would want a friendly candidate in the White House. So I think, yes, data analytics itself is a neutral tool. And there's nothing improper about doing it. I used to do, going through voter rolls and trying to identify supporters, canvassing is just a very standard type thing, and canvassing gets more and more sophisticated as your tools become more sophisticated. I mean, we used to do it by looking at how people voted in the past, but by different precincts and things like that, and targeting those precincts. And that's very standard. It's just that it's become much more sophisticated.
It's amazing that American society was duped by some of these advertising campaigns and shared them, and they got stuck in echo chambers and then kept going.
On the other hand, there are people who don't believe any of this had an impact. And I've spoken to some of these people, some of them from intelligentsia, telling me, an overestimation of the impact of this fake news on the social media platforms. And nothing I can say, even the statistics I give them about the number of bots that were unleashed, drowning out the hashtag I'm with her and doing other things in the Brexit situation, to leave and not remain. Nothing I could show as evidence.
Well, I would recommend they look at, there's an article in New Yorker about Jameson, basically where Jameson is the principal. I think I sent it to you.
Yes.
The article is written around an interview of her discussing it. But as I said, indeed, it's possible that the advertisements on Facebook by the Trump campaign done by Perscale could have had a similar impact. I really do. I mean, there's no way of knowing. You can't run an experiment ex post facto on that. I mean, most people guess that it wasn't that in terms of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? I don't know. It just seems like the Trump campaign in the final few days did not target as many ads at Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as the Russian operation did. And that some people may remember that Obama was in Michigan at the very end, and he was in Pennsylvania. The Clinton campaign was clueless about what was going on. And he, through his own network, got a sense that things were not going well. But it may just be that the Russians' intelligence operation was better than in terms of the feedback that they were getting from their tools were better than the Trump people and Perscale was getting from their tools. There's no way of really knowing.
So I read that there were 85,000 micro-targeted messages and messaging types going to people of different profiles. And we all know about the Kaczynski formula, the ocean approach, which was to measure people's neuroticism, how agreeable they are, how open they are in attitude and so forth, neuroticism and so forth. And one of the things that they noted was voters who can get angry quickly are swing voters.
Yeah.
So one day they could be thinking, I'm going to vote for Hillary, the next I'll vote for Trump. But the number of micro-targeted messages actually caught my attention, as did the fact that when they were sending those micro-targeted messages, they were also putting Trump in pictures. So we saw the bad side of Hillary here.
Right.
You also had the angelic Trump in many different manifestations, different color suits, different visions and views of him, and if that's the level of imagery we were micro-targeting as, so you've shown us the one side of the demonization of Hillary, but there was also the other side of the, angelic Trump, which came through in many of the micro-postings.
Yeah. Upper right, you see that.
Yeah, exactly.
Lower right. Actually, this is also something which I've used for other presentations. Alan Lichtman's The Key to the White House. And this is a sort of a strategic view in terms of who should win an election. It's a useful thing, but
yes.
Let's see. Let me see if I have any positive. Yeah, let's just jump down. Just want to see if any like Trump photos which actually would have been used by his campaign. I don't think I do. So I used to run the videos of both campaign, basically the convention videos that they had. I actually used that when I was on my Fulbright in Lithuania.
You are definitely doing this.
Me talking to you and Bob.
And others on the internet.
Go ahead. Future people, that's the most important. It is live, but
it is live?
Mostly future people.
Do I have the clicker, right?
Yes.
All right. I begin. So, no matter where you look, like you look at recent reports from the National Academy or European Commission or advisory bodies on bioethics or Nuclear Regulatory Commission, everybody uses the word public engagement. The Bioethics Commission says deliberative process, when they came out with their advisory. But nobody gives you a roadmap about how to do that, because it's actually not easy. And it's not easy because what Dan said, because this is not, you cannot wait for the science to be done or an expert body to educate about the uncertainties. It's about when there's high uncertainty and high decision stakes and you still need to make policy. So so people care about, that post-normal science. And I'm only talking about a particular class of problems that are complex socio-scientific. I'm not talking about the regular ones that, we can figure out the error bar and whether it's safe or not, and then we can have expert educate and then, go through the normal process. So that's because these problems kind of fall into this category. We have our socio-political process for sorting out things. We have problems, we have different actors, the stakeholder engagement, then we make them into laws, regulations, and so forth. And then there are things that are, comes from the science end. In the normal science, in that curve, in this place, applied normal science, you will, feed into the process the results. Or if it relies on expert judgment, you have like the Office of Technology Assessment or National Academies, and they can give the input to the process. But once it gets beyond that, where you cannot get a clear signal from either of those bodies, but you still need to make decisions, so how do you go about doing that? And this is the last edition of Science, and they were looking at gene editing, and you see a bunch of luminaries, and what they're suggesting that we propose a coordinating body that can convene communities, technology developers, governmental and non-governmental organizations in ways that ensures inclusive deliberations. Such a body would serve as a neutral third party to help inform decision-making that is free from conflicts of interest and locally based. This organization would, they have 4 principles, establish a deliberation framework that integrates diverse expertise and worldviews, including participants that represent impacted communities, facilitate deliberation to produce standardized reports and deliver recommendations, establish information sharing protocols to connect deliberations around the world, and report on the outcomes of the deliberation to inform global governance of gene editing. But this is the prescription that they offer. So I was kind of intrigued by that because that's what we've been doing. But one thing we decided to do differently, and that was that we knew that such a body could not be part of any political process. So it couldn't be placed in government, it couldn't be placed in the legislative branch, because then it would be susceptible to that cycle. But also an independent entity, if you do create one, then it will become like the Bioethics Commission or things like that, that has a limited mandate and then it expires. So it cannot do sustained engagement as different topics emerge. So what we back in 2010 came up proposing that instead of thinking of a body, why don't we imagine a distributed institutional framework? And we proposed this framework as a network of universities, science museums, and nonpartisan policy think tanks. Why did we say that? Because you need, obviously, expertise. You need subject matter expertise, you need deliberation expertise, and that will come from the university. But you also need engagement. You need to engage communities, you need to engage diverse stakeholders. That kind of expertise, and you need to provide a safe, neutral convening ground. Science museums can provide that. And then you also ultimately need a link to policy. And we need what we said, nonpartisan policy think tanks. So originally when we proposed this idea was that the university node would come from ASU, the museum node was exemplified by Museum of Science Boston, and the policy analysis part at that point, because we were not, we had just reinstated the CSPO operation in DC, we said the Woodrow Wilson Center would be that. And that's how we proposed this. And the whole idea is to not to substitute expertise, but add to expertise a public participation component. So the public value and the expert opinions can be mixed and create an additional input to the decision-making process. And it needs to be institutional, non-partisan. It needs to be inviting, and needs to be continuously innovating. So it doesn't, because we know this is a deliberative process. Every process generates new learning, and from that you continuously improve. So this is what, in principle, is called participatory technology assessment. The Danish Board of Technology and LOCA Institute and few others have been sort of working in this space for a long time, and there's established methodology. It's basically trying to add a missing voice of the disengaged publics that are not participating in the policy development process, either through advocacy or through profession, to engage them in an informed dialogue. So how do we do that? So this is the same picture I showed before, but what I've added is a middle column here. And this is actually a standard process that's used in transdisciplinary research design. And this is where your presentation, the part about framing, so framing is very important in any discourse, whether it's done for political reasons or for policy deliberation. So the first step of this process is to frame the problem, bringing in the scientists, the technical people, the technologists, and also the social and policy scientists, and say what's the problem that we want to deliberate on. So that's kind of step one, and that's what we do as the first step. So it's usually a workshop for us to bring in all these diverse stakeholders to say what kind of questions we want to ask the public, what information do they need to know, who are the publics, where should we hold this deliberation, what do they need to know. So once that's done, then we take the expert out of the process, and then we develop the tools of engagement. And that's when we work with the museums to take these complex socio-scientific issues, translate it into a language and that the public will understand. And then so we deliberate, and we, with a demographically representative public, usually we also determine who is least represented, and we try to target those groups more so we can get their values and get their input. And once it's all done, we again then bring back the experts. So that's when we feed back to both the technology and the science side, and also on the policy side. So this is kind of the framework with which we proposed. And you can see this is a different than how we had been solving our problems in the past. And so, but this was an experimental design. So we needed a proof of concept, right? We can actually do this. So we did the first project that we actually was able to do the right side of it, not necessarily engaging with the policy development piece, was a project we did with NASA. And that project was, NASA was trying to understand public views and values about their asteroid initiative, which was a very unpopular initiative because this was something Obama administration did after canceling the going back to the moon mission. I forget the name of the constellation, or I forget what the name of it was. And the expert community, like the National Academy, also questioned because they thought that NASA should be directing everything to journey to Mars, and the asteroid seems like a distraction. I mean, a diversion, or they couldn't understand. So NASA wanted to actually try to create a new constituency for this mission, and in the process open the door for us to engage with people outside of the planetary societies, outside of their normal engagement process. And so when we got that opportunity, we brought in our two missions, which is actually both, which is one side is that there is an informal societal element embedded in our normative approach. That is, we want to stimulate discussions. We want to explore public reaction and support feedback, and want to connect scientists with the public. But then we have a formal mission as well. We want to connect, not just do engagement for the sake of engagement, but also connect it to the decision-making process. So these two dual goals, and we bring in some design principles. Therefore, one is it has to have diverse representation. And we don't mean in a statistical sense necessarily, because we know, because we do this large deliberation with 100 people. So if there's 1% of the population is indigenous, you bring that Native American person in a room, he or she cannot have a conversation. He will never be able to extract what their views, values are. So what we do is we get a critical mass of all of those groups. We know instead of having 55% white, you can have 50% white, and you can get the values from that particular group. So this is kind of a judgment call we do, and we sort of change that. That's why I said it goes into the design phase. Who would be the right group to target more? For instance, we're doing a deliberation on the future of internet right now. And for that, we're focusing on connectivity. We're trying to get all different types of users. We have another project with autonomous vehicles. There we're looking at different users of transportations and trying to not just go with demographic data. And then we want it to be deliberative and multi-directional, because obviously we provide information, we show videos, but what we also understand that there's a mutual learning that comes from people's lived experiences. And it's remarkable to see how that actually because we do pre and post surveys of people who participate, and we can see how much their knowledge gained, not only because what we provided, but what we learned they also learned from each other. And one other thing is that we want the results to be clear and comparable, so that the deliberation done in Boston can be compared with the done in Phoenix and Washington and other parts of the world, so we can see how they differ from one place to another. So anyway, so there's the 4 elements. It's again in a different way presented. I'm not going to go over. So some of the demographic criteria we use: age, education, employment, gender, urban, rural. But then we also limit, because for instance, if it's climate deliberation, we don't want the room full of climate activists. So we actually ask these questions in the recruitment process because we know in the US, 17% of the population is about say, active in climate. So we don't, we try to play with that number. And obviously, as I said, limit, but then we also increase the numbers based on our target. So this is kind of what we use. They get an information booklet beforehand. They watch videos when they come. And then they get a lot of deliberation materials. There's scenarios. There's a different way we try to give them the information so it becomes an interactive learning experience. And the museums are really good at doing that. In addition to that, and one thing that came up, I forget whose presentation today, where we always, when we do deliberation, we'd like to see, it was the score, right? What did I get in the exam, right? When we do climate deliberation, if we show you your local community, people try to find their house. People try to see how I will be affected with this different level of sea level rise. So the goal is not to do that. The goal is to get them to think about other people. So we actually, that's why what we do is a stakeholder value mapping. So we say, okay, first of all, we actually do not their own situation, but a hypothetical but rich socio-scientific situation. And then we play this value game where we say, okay, this person, this is a climate exercise, climate resilience exercise. What do you think the civil engineer will think about this solution? Or what do you think the Boston Development Authority director would think about the disruption it's going to cause, while we are doing this? So by that process, we have already kind of also sensitized the people about that there's different values and perspectives and goals at play other than their own. So they don't do role playing, but they understand how would this particular different solution sets people will feel about. So we do a stakeholder value mapping in addition to the information we provide. And then we give them scenarios. This is from the asteroid initiatives. We say that there's a 4-year scenario, that a mid-range near Earth object is coming. So what kind of, and these are your 5 options that you have. You can use a gravity tractor, or you can use a nuclear detonation, you can so forth. These are the options. What will you do? And then just to see whether that's, what's the elasticity of that decision, we throw in hypotheticals. So this is kind of thing we do with, so to see whether their answers change or not. So we do all of this, and then, and the way we do this is that the day is broken into different sessions. So for the asteroid one, they started with a planetarium show that told them about what asteroids are. Then the day is broken into thematic sessions. The first session was detection. The second one was about mitigation. The third one was about asteroid redirect mission. They have group deliberation. During the deliberation, they can actually ask questions to experts, but we do that through online because from social science studies, we know that there is a tendency of experts, when you ask a question, they want you to understand exactly, get everything right, but that's not the purpose here. And also there is a factor when experts are introduced, people stop talking. That's not the intent either. So we do this through an online interface. And we also, so everybody benefits from the answer. And then they vote, they share their answers. And the way they vote is that they do individual, they do, which you can see how many people are in favor or against of different options. But they also do, they make a plan as a group. So they create narratives. So they write why they chose this particular option and so forth. So we get both data that you can quantify and also data you can have a quality. So we basically have 5 different sources of data. We have the demographic data because we know who they are. We have the pre and post surveys. We ask them what knowledge they came with, what they left. We have the deliberation results that I just showed. And we also collect table observation. How did the conversation go? So we have table observers in the tables. And then sometimes we do post-deliberation interviews. So through this process, we generate tons and tons of data. And then it becomes this difficult task of, how do you report that data? So we write a lot of publications, we do summary data, depending on however crosscut you want. So we do publications and reports, and this is our way to feed back into the policy processes. So what are the outcomes for citizens? We build capacity to make better societal decisions, develop civic responsibility that people think they see NASA coming in and asking them questions. They say, oh, this is a good use of our tax dollar. They actually care about what we think. It makes a big difference. Same way when we do climate deliberations, when we have the UN Secretary of UNFCCC inviting them, it creates that legitimacy and they feel like part of. So it builds, express diversity of values, builds trust between scientists or the institutions or the bodies. And obviously it provides us both a social and technical knowledge to the policy process. Outcomes for decision makers, you understand public preferences, public priorities within a set of choices, public value mapping, emerging areas of agreement or disagreements, because we have insight on how public understands unanticipated outcomes. This is really something very interesting because people make different connections. So when we did the NASA project, we were asking about what values do you care about? The scientific return, the technological return, the economic return. What we found out that what was of concern to them was that there was no agency for planetary defense. There's nobody trusted with that responsibility. And once that actually was captured, came over and over again in the written explanation, NASA actually paid attention. And after the deliberation, NASA actually created Office of Planetary Defense. Well, and the Planetary Defense Officer for NASA will publicly said here that, the creation of his office was facilitated by having that public value input. So this is an actual case where we could say that a deliberation had an impact in the decision-making process. So, there are all kinds of things. We generate tons of data, depending on how you want to cross-cut, you can get a lot of value out of it. Now, the only problem with all of this is that the model I showed was an expert framing of the problem. What if the citizens wanted to answer a different question than what we put on the table? So we did a little experiment, and this is our experiment with the autonomous vehicle. We went and did focus groups, spent 2 weekends with 2 groups, one in Cumberland, Maryland, and another one in Baltimore, and talked to them about driverless cars, giving them very little information, and trying to understand what was their concerns, what was their hopes, and trying to glean from that. And the second weekend, we actually went and we told them, okay, these are what the experts are thinking about this. Now, how do you think about it? And what was the interesting thing was that we came away with these categories are what we found as experts talking about, but what we found that they cared about things that their priority level was different. And what was most concerning to them was the social relationship aspect of driverless cars. Because this is something where the hopes and fears were so intertwined. So when we asked them, what do you want? What makes you excited when we tell you about driverless cars? They said, I don't have to take my parents to the doctor's appointment anymore, or my kids to the soccer practice. That's so much time I will save. So I will have a lot of free time. And within seconds, they will say, but that's my only contact with them. And I don't know, how will I know where they're going? Or instead of the doctor, is my dad going to go to the casino next door? So, and the same thing with the children. So we see that, by having this bottom-up process, we get a different map of the different choices that we have if we went this route. And so the common concern was hacking, safety, alignment of laws, accommodation for disadvantage. Some of the people who cannot currently drive, for them this was as an opportunity. But still they brought up these concerns. So, you know, there's a trace stuff, cost of infrastructure, loss of job, intrusive marketing, and so forth. So what were the less obvious issues? Well, one was rural versus, so when we talk about driverless cars, this is what we talk about. We never talk about that. And that's, so the things that they bring up is that, you know, we probably will never see this. You know, so the whole equity issue that, you know, they feel like, you know, this is a benefit that's going to happen, but they will not be able to retrieve gain from it. And then they were also concerned about different things, like, you know, Cumberland is where the three states kind of meet, and there's all the trucks come in. They said, you know, those trucks come in, when they come in, you know, they catch fire because the brakes are, you know, worn out, and the drivers drive them beyond, and we have to deal, we have a small fire department that has to go deal with this. You know, can we make the truck safer so that they don't do all of that? But then don't take away the jobs, because that, you know, so it's the improve the trucks, but don't take the jobs. So these kind of things, you know, if you ask like the Boston Consulting Group to say, what are your policy choices? None of these will show up in their metrics. There was a volunteer firefighter who was concerned, okay, how am I going to cut through these cars? I don't even know where the batteries will be. How do I get a person out? You know, I'm afraid of blowing things up. There's a whole range of retraining that needs to be done to the rescue. And interestingly enough, I was at a highway automation conference in Phoenix, and the only group that Waymo is engaging with in Phoenix is the emergency responders, because they know that will be the Cree constituency that's going to make or break, because Waymo is designing their cars to be independent of the infrastructure. That means it should, so they're not trying to talk with the DOT to make the roads or the sensors and this and that. They're trying to work within the system, what is available now, but they are working with the firefighters and first responders. So I thought that was very interesting. But this is kind of issues came up from one focus group in Cumberland. So you can imagine, you know, things that you can generate by having this dialogue. And then there was another concern. Okay, if everything is uniform, everybody going in one speed, I have a pregnant wife, when am I allowed to break the laws? Again, we don't think about these things, but these were kind of concerns that bubbles up when you engage with the public. So anyway, there were tons and tons of examples. So what our takeaway from that experiment was that non-experts are very capable of constructing analogies from their personal experience to generate useful, unique, and local information framing for future deliberations. Should hold open framing and structured deliberation in tandem with expert framing. Rural versus urban is a useful distinction. We shouldn't forget by having all of our deliberation in the cities. And that's also something from the results from the elections, right? We missed, with all our polling data, we didn't get the heartbeat of the rural America, and that's what, you know, voted majority in one particular direction. So by not engaging them, we are also disenfranchising a large sector of population segment. And citizen framing of issues allows for much richer discussion with more nuanced debate over values and community concerns rather than expert framing. So what we are now trying to do with emerging technologies is try to make it a hybrid approach. Because what happens with emerging technologies, you will not have agreement within the experts. What are the scenarios? Because so we have a project on solar geoengineering. This is about, you know, reflecting sunlight so that you can cool down the earth. You can do it several ways. You can whiten the clouds, or you can create an aerosol cloud, and so forth. But when we wanted to design our deliberation our standard way and had our expert workshop, experts could not agree what scenarios we should deliberate on. So what we did was that since the experts themselves cannot agree, why don't we let the public also deliberate over the scenarios? And so in our hybrid approach, what we did we gave them different research methods. We didn't say, pick this one and figure out what the option should be. And then we also told them, you choose the research direction. You can choose not to do any research, or you can do the moonshot. Or you can choose computer modeling and everything in between. So, and then once you've done that, now figure out who should fund this. Should government fund this? Should the private sector fund this? Should NGO fund this? Should universities do this? And then once you've figured it out, then you figure out how you want to govern. What are your priorities? Should it be scientists themselves, self-governance? Or should it be an advisory committee? Or should it be a state and local? Or should it be federal or something at the international level? So this way, we gave them the option that they actually created all these scenarios. So normally, we had 100 people in Boston. That was 12 tables in Boston and 14 tables in Phoenix. And so we have these 26 storyboards about people making different choices and then based on those choices, thinking what should be the funding and the governance mechanism. And we did it also because when we actually did the NASA project and we told them, okay, 60% liked option B and 40% liked option A, we gave them, they started questioning that results. They started, okay, who was in the room? What information did you give them? Because for NASA, it was an existential crisis because there was a group who worked on one option and the group worked another one. So, but then the value proposition for them was not the answer, but how people were thinking about it. So they wanted to know the narrative. So in that case, we had to go back through our table observation and the answers, recreate the story, how people arrived at the answer. But so here we actually created a storyboard so people could actually capture the answer to the whole day. So they chose the research direction, what type of research, what type of funding, what are their governance priorities, what governance structure, and then the hypothetical if this situation changes and so forth. So at the end of the day, we had these storyboards. So this is, I think, do you have volume? Well, anyway, you can see this is just the deliberation. So that's all I have. Thank you. Questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm very impressed, Mahmoud, and makes me feel very happy to see so many people involved. My question for you is, what do we say to people, academics in particular, who say machines can make better decisions and you're trying to prioritize issues and we can go automatically and troll through social media and find the data, perform sentiment analysis, and then prioritize on themes, and decisions can be made in a technocratic way. What is missing from that approach that you see when you interact with people?
The face-to-face, because in the NASA project, we actually did an online version of it as well, and it failed miserably. It failed miserably, and because, you know, when you're not here, when you're sitting around the table, talking with each other, sharing a meal, spending a whole day, the quality and the depth and the openness and the information that you were able to provide, and in an anonymous environment, the information that you get are very, very different. So what happened is NASA was very afraid when we did this deliberation, because they were actually taking big hit from the Planetary Society and all of the public meeting where they would go and present their asteroid mission, and people would. So Lindy Johnson, who is the Planetary Defense Officer, and he actually was going to pull the plug because they didn't want a public exposure. And they thought that people would just, you know, crash the servers, they would show up, line up, and nothing happened. Same thing with geoengineering. The fear was the chemtrailers will come and crash and kill the deliberation in Phoenix, because the proposed experiment that Harvard is proposing was going to happen in Tucson, Arizona with the balloon company. And if you look at the social media, they're taking hits. I mean, to the point that David Keith is no longer the front person of that whole experiment. So, but yes, we know from the data that who came, there were chemtrailers in the audience. But they were not disruptive. They participated. They asked questions about chemtrails. So same thing with climate. When we had Tea Partiers in 2015, came with their leaflets and so forth. But if they see the process, that they get equal say, and that we are honest, neutral brokers, we don't actually have a say in the outcome. Our normative proposition is that it needs to be diverse, it needs to be representative, it needs to be informed, it needs to be deliberate. Other than that, we're not saying this is good or this is bad. So I think without this proper contextualization, curation, and the face-to-face element, I don't think the data that you get from just mining what's online, you miss. And I think that's what actually also happened with the election. The polling data was so wrong. So, you know, I think there's a certain value. Basically, we are trying to create, I mean, in a small way, how society should engage about these topics, but by recreating what an informed dialogue might look like. I mean, this week I actually got an email from one of the participants in the solar geoengineering forum. She said, you know, I've been reading this in the paper that you can flood the deserts. Why didn't you tell us about that option? Now, you know, obviously that wasn't an option, that it wasn't important for the discussion, but that person is now engaged in the topic. She is actually looking for geoengineering and climate-related topics. So we have created citizenry that is informed and engaged and on this issue that wasn't, and you will not get that, I don't think, by just mining the data. Is that so? Okay? Is that it? No? Bob? My question to you, do you think this kind of process can complement an OTA kind of effort in a positive way?
Yeah,
because
so I think the debate that's going to happen with bringing back OTA and the AAAS effort and all that stuff is that the world has moved on and realizes that technical expertise is an important input, but it's an incomplete process. But I completely agree with where you started this whole presentation, which is everybody says go do it. Mm-hmm. You know, like the gene editing thing from the National Academy says go do it, and then who are you going to do it with? FDA and NIH. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not going to work, is it? So I think you're in a place where we need to have a more systematic process that we kind of can think about. Yeah, we can rely on that to actually help us through this. And that's when we're trying to think through our problems for our community on just even something as narrow as the genomic variant stuff. We're trying to figure out, what does public engagement mean, and what does it look like, what does it feel like? And we know some constituencies that have been left out, but this this whole process is, I think, relatively new, and OTA stopped in 1995, and that was 20 years ago, and the world has moved on, and this is certainly part of it now. So, I mean, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, the Europeans actually took the OTA model, and that's the innovation they added to it. They still regard OTA as the innovation that, you know, they carried into Europe with the Parliamentary Technology Assessment Association, you know, the PACITA and all of that. And they added, because they're more democratic, so they made it part of Parliament. But they also met the same fate, like the Danish Board of Technology, which used to be part of the Danish Parliament, and now they lost their funding, and they are now a foundation. So I think that, you know, our argument about trying to think about a structure that can survive the political cycles is also kind of important.
I think that's right. But one other thing that I think is also really important, and it's kind of implicit in what you were talking about, is the part of our political system that is most broken is the part that it's the top layer at the national level. And I think there's still a lot of productive politics that's happening at lower levels and more local levels. And that's the part that I think maybe we need to be, and that's, OTA didn't do that. OTA did stuff for congressional committees, and it was by definition and by function associated with the layer that's most broken now. And I think there's a whole level of politics that's much more productive, even in the United States. I'm not as pessimistic about our politics. I'm super pessimistic about the national level, but I'm not about the local level. And I think that's just something that's going on.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. Okay, thank you.